Hello, everyone, and we are now recording. Welcome to the second technical workshop in Phase 3 of the Aliso Canyon OII proceeding. That's 17-02-002. My name is Eileen Hlafko, and I'm with the California Public Utilities Commission Energy Division, and I'll be emceeing the logistics and Q&A for this workshop. I believe we will be having California Senator Henry Stern calling in for some opening remarks, followed by the California Public Utilities Commission's Commissioner Martha Guzman-Aceves. I do not see Senator Stern ready, so we will start with an introduction from ALJ Zhang, who is the Administrative Law Judge in this proceeding. ALJ Zhang, are you ready? Go ahead.
Good afternoon. I will give a short intro, including some logistics. Thank you. Next slide. Please take note of the Webex login information in case you lose your connection. For safety, please note your emergency exit and check your ergonomic position at your desk. Next slide, please. Please review your Webex controls and locate the mute and unmute button. This is the most important button because if you are unmuted, it could disrupt everyone else's audio. Please locate the chat option and the raise your hand button. These are the controls that you will use to ask your questions. Also, after you ask your question, please mute yourself. Next slide, please. We want this workshop to be engaging and productive. Please be respectful. We've had many workshops with this group, and I have no doubt that it will go smoothly. Next slide, please. Today's workshop is part of Phase 3 of the Aliso Canyon Order Instituting investigation, in which the Commission is to determine how the services presently provided by the Aliso Canyon gas field will be met if the field is eliminated. In Phase 1, the Commission published a final scenarios framework. Phase 2 is ongoing as the Commission evaluates the impacts to system reliability and electric and gas rates of reducing or eliminating the use of the natural gas facility. FTI Consulting and Gas Supply Consulting will give an update of the proposed portfolios that will replace Aliso. They will also describe the analytical methods, software inputs, assumptions, and data sets. Now I will turn it over to Commissioner Guzman-Aceves for introductory remarks.
Thank you, Judge Zhang, and thank you everyone for being here today on such an important workshop. As Judge Zhang mentioned, we're here to discuss what I think is really the heart of this overall proceeding. And really in the hard work of figuring out how we can ultimately decommission Aliso Canyon and what it will take to maintain reliable and affordable service during that transition. The work we're doing today is really the beginning of this very intense process that I hope all of you will engage in to ensure that our scenarios are as accurate as possible. And our portfolio ultimately is the most clear and sustainable pathway to getting off of Aliso. I look forward to hearing from all the parties and the stakeholders on what adjustments may be needed to the FTI work that you'll be learning about today and the framework that they're proposing. And in particular on the specific questions that they have put out and will be putting out in their presentation. I very much look forward to everyone's input both today, but also in the follow-up engagement that we will have as part of this process. So thank you very much, and thank you, Judge Zhang. I'll turn it back to you.
I believe now we're waiting for the senator. Eileen, do you see him present? Okay,
Oh,
Senator.
great. Okay,
I am-
Senator Stern.
All right.
Yes, welcome, Senator Stern.
All right. Thanks, Commissioner Guzman-Cebes, especially and the PUC staff for making an invitation on this technical workshop. I know that there's a lot of technical work to be done here, but I guess I just wanted, as the representative for the area, the Aliso Canyon area and all the neighboring communities, thank you for your diligence on this and for listening to all of our stakeholders, and especially the people most directly impacted by this tragic event that I think is truly at risk of being forgotten outside of circles like this. It's easy to hit the snooze on disasters after they happen because there's so many other disasters going on, but I can tell you that it's not in the rear view for everyone living in the shadow of that gas field. So I hope that, you know, as you go forward in this technical analysis, that you know, when you look to the real intent when we passed SB 380, when I was working for Senator Pavley before I got the honor of serving this community, that the legislature, we feel, really wanted to see closure here, and you know that we've had two governors commit to it, but I think the community is eager for an urgent resolution to this, and so we don't want it to become a situation where the burden is on you know, participants in the proceeding to have the sort of burden of proof of exactly how much, you know, how to provide replacement services and hit a perfect number to result in closure. I think the overall momentum hopefully here is to push the community and to push all the stakeholders who need to make changes. And that's both at the utility level, that's at the local government level, that's in terms of things like our building codes and new construction development. That's about, you know, core customers and the power sector. That's about how we get to SB 100 very expeditiously. And we saw an encouraging report from DWP. And so we know there's a lot of external factors to this proceeding that will make all this quote unquote feasible. But I hope that we maintain both an aspirational and independent thrust to this whole effort. You know, we appreciate that there's going to be some discussion about modeling, and the third-party consultants I know are going to be joining, so we'll be listening in on all that. But I think that there is a lot of consensus about being aggressive about making this transition, and I hope that the modeling that we adopt and the scenarios that we lay out for looking at how that is feasible is not such a question of whether or not it's feasible, but how it's going to be feasible. Because I think it's more of a question of how as opposed to if. And I think that assurance for the community will be huge. So I just I appreciate you guys doing the homework here today. I hope you'll keep taking into account as these proceedings evolve, especially into phase 3, some of the outstanding modeling concepts that may inform phase 2 going forward in terms of what the actual service capacity is, and that we can be adaptive as we move forward here and hopefully get some near-term action, because it is a rush for everyone living there and for everyone living in Los Angeles and for everyone hopefully living on this planet. We know we need to make the move. So anyway, thanks for indulging my my remarks here, and I do appreciate especially everyone from the community, folks like Dr. Najim, who's been on this for so many years at Porter Ranch Neighborhood Council, and since I guess semi-retired from that position. People like that and our Save Porter Ranch community and all the other, you know, folks out there who've been organizing, really appreciate y'all. So thanks again.
Thank you, Senator Stern, and thank you for your leadership on not just your community here, but of course, in all the statewide leadership that you've given to these issues. And we most definitely appreciate the community's involvement, continued involvement through this process. Okay. Judge Zhang, I'll turn back to you.
I believe FTI Consulting is up next. Matt, are you ready?
I am, thank you, Your Honor. I'll wait a moment for the deck to come up.
Eileen, I'm hoping you could pass the baton to me and I'll share the deck.
So I think we can jump into it. While we're waiting for that to come up, just quick introductions. My name is Matthew DeCourcy. I'm a managing director at FTI Consulting and one of the leads on this project. And we're talking today about what we're calling Workstream 2, which is the next phase of our analysis that builds on some of the work we presented in November and some of the work that was done in previous phases of this investigation, and that we hope will drive us towards completion of the engagement. Todd, if you want to flip forward one more. So as Judge Zhang said, Workstream 2 is modeling heavy. Much of the discussion today is going to be about the tools we're going to use, about the assumptions that we're going to make, about the analyses we're going to undertake. So this is a good time to mention that none of the inputs that we plan to apply here and none of the assumptions that we're going to make are yet finalized. This is a big opportunity for us to get feedback from all of the participants in this proceeding on the reasonableness of what we plan to do and sort of ideas for going forward. We're going to be presenting what are effectively straw man proposals for certain elements of that, but all of those are really invitations for comment and discussion. As we go through, we're going to ask for your input on very specific issues that we think are important to us and certainly particularly uncertain, but also sort of looking for thoughts on the entirety of the scope and what we have in mind. After our last session, we got some really good input that helped advance our thinking and changed our direction in some places, some of which is reflected here. So we're hoping that the same thing happens here. In terms of today's discussion, I'm going to be walking through Workstream 2 at a very high level, talking about how we're taking the results from Workstream 1, the work we've already presented, and expanding on that as we sort of move towards completion here. I'm also going to be talking about a couple of the investment options that we can make that could potentially facilitate an Aliso Canyon retirement. I will be talking about two of the simpler alternatives. My colleague, Tim Sexton of GSC, Gas Supply Consulting, will be talking about some of the more complex issues regarding investments in gas infrastructure that we have to work through. And then my other colleague, Venki Venkateshwara, another managing director at FTI, will be talking about some of those same issues on the electric transmission side and how we might be able to invest in electric transmission to potentially facilitate an Aliso retirement without negative impacts to reliability. Todd, you want to flip ahead? One more. So, as the name would imply, Workstream 2 follows on Workstream 1, in which we had done an operational analysis of the Socal gas, or the gas and electric systems in Southern California. And we found that the systems are very reliant on Aliso Canyon during high demand conditions. That's to say that we found that barring any other changes beyond the ones that are already envisioned, we cannot retire Aliso Canyon in either 2027 or 2035 without making other investments in infrastructure to offset the impacts. I don't think any of that was a surprising finding. Those results are very much in line with the work done by the CPUC and some other consultants during phase 2. Where we are helping to advance the discussion is looking forward to those solutions. And I think in that sense, our approach is generally consistent with some of the things that Senator Stern was talking about, insofar as we have conducted the modeling in order to measure the shortfall in resources. Sometimes we call it a resource gap that emerges if you retire Aliso and you hold all the other assumptions constant. And then we've designed some investments in infrastructure, gas infrastructure and electric infrastructure, that we think will fill those gaps. So workstream 1 was focused on identifying that shortfall and quantifying the magnitude of that gap. We have now identified some investments that we would make that we think fill the gap. And now we pivot to workstream 2, where we're going to take those investments and we're going to analyze the costs and the benefits that are associated with each in order to hopefully inform decision-making by the policymakers a little bit further down the road. Todd, you want to flip ahead? So an important part of this discussion is that we're changing our perspectives here as we go from workstream 1 to workstream 2. Previously, workstream 1 had been an operational study. We were focused on peak day types of analyses under highly constrained conditions to understand the operation of the system during that short time step. We had what we're calling a capacity orientation. We needed to know what was the capability of the system that was needed to operate safely with and without Aliso Canyon. Now, as we move to workstream 2, our perspective changes a little bit. Now we're thinking about things from this cost-benefit perspective, in which we're going to be letting the investments that are informed by the results of workstream 1 sort of be presumed to be built, and then we're going to take a long-term forward look at how they perform economically and operationally, what kind of benefits they provide to ratepayers in California in terms of reduced energy prices, in terms of reduced volatility, in terms of reduced emissions. And we're going to be comparing those to the costs of each of them and hopefully providing the basis to rank order the net benefits of each of these projects. So here in the second phase, we're taking what we're calling an energy orientation, whereas we're moving away from a focus on capacity, and we're thinking more about how energy prices change, how they change over time, and sort of how they change across 8,760 hours a year and 20 years into the future. Let's flip to the next one. So just as a reminder, this is the shortfall. This is the resource gap that we identified during workstream 1. Specifically, we find that if you retire Aliso Canyon and you don't make any other changes beyond those that are currently envisioned in the IRP, that you cannot simultaneously deliver enough gas to serve core demand and electric generation. The result of which is you have a shortfall of about 4,800 megawatts in 2027 and about 2,900 megawatts in 2035 during these most constrained hours that we modeled. We also can talk about the shortfall in terms of gas capacity. So during our peak hour, our most constrained hour in 2027, we're talking about a shortfall of about 33 MMCF per day, which translates to a little more than 400 MMCF per day. And in 2035, again, those numbers are lower. This is because gas demand is falling over time. So these findings kind of set the bogey for us. This is how much new infrastructure we need. And it gives us kind of two targets that we can move and shift amongst each other. We can solve this problem by building new infrastructure that creates a change in the supply-demand balance on the gas side. So we either have more gas or need less of it. Or we can do the same on the electric side. So we have more electricity or need less of it. Or we can do both, provided that our total sort of change to the system capability sums up to these values here. We close that resource gap, in which case we can retire Aliso Canyon. And again, we've designed portfolios of investments that we think do exactly that. So our mandate going forward isn't trying to identify what it is we could do to fix it. We think we have sort of solutions that will work at a high level. Our mandate is taking those solutions and understanding sort of what the economic and financial impacts would be and which of them are going to be the most economically and operationally efficient through the modeling that we're going to undertake. There are two qualifiers to the data on this slide. One is minor, one is significant. The minor one is this represents a small change to the results that we had presented in November. That's just the outcome of a small change in the methodology that we applied. We think these are better. We think it's not a frankly impactful difference. The other change, though, could be very impactful. Later today, we're going to be talking about potentially changing some of the assumptions that we used in workstream 1 and that were used during phase 2 of this analysis. And if we do, will change these values significantly. These relate to certain assumptions regarding the capability and operation of the gas system during the peak days. We will call these out as we go along. But just bear in mind that these bogeys here could shift, and if they do, they'll almost certainly increase. Let's go to the next slide. So here are the investments that we currently propose to analyze. Again, thoughts are very welcome on all of this. But we have two sets of investments that change the supply-demand balance on the gas side. Here we have this target of the 434 MMCF per day on this most constrained day that we modeled. And so we think we can fill that particular gap by either investing in new gas transmission infrastructure, in which case we would basically upgrade the certain elements of the Socal gas system, or we can reduce demand by the same amount. And here we think it's most likely that we will be taking the SCG energy efficiency programs and scaling them up to meet the shortfall. And we'll talk about how we're going to do both of those and how we're going to analyze those as we go forward. On the electric side, we have two effectively supply side investment packages. One is what we're calling the IRP mix, wherein we take the results of the last IRP and the reference system plan that shook out of that. And we say, okay, that creates an expectation for new infrastructure. We will just scale up those expectations pro rata until we meet the megawatt shortfall. The second portfolio is an electric transmission portfolio. Here, we're going to look at projects that are in development and under consideration and use those as a template to consider new electric transmission projects that, again, does the same thing, increases the amount of energy that's not reliant on Aliso Canyon by an amount equal to the gap that we've identified, and in so doing allows for the retirement of the facility in either 27 or 35. It's important to note here that we are sort of analyzing these packages separately at the moment. In the real world, it may well be the case that an optimal or a preferred solution will be some combination of these things. For the time being, we are intentionally modeling these investments separately because we think it'll help give us insight into the costs and the benefits associated with each. There are certainly shortcomings of that approach, and if there are alternatives, we're eager to hear them. But we think, on balance, it's more useful to do it this way than to sort of combine different types of elements into a single portfolio, at which point it becomes very difficult to suss out sort of what might be driving benefits, what might be putting drag on benefits, whether we should focus on this type of infrastructure or that type of investment. We think doing it this way will give us a clearer look to answer those kinds of questions. And then we also have reserved this fifth portfolio for many of those same reasons, so that later on we can specify what's going to be another portfolio of investments that we'll consider. But we're gonna analyze that, and we're gonna design that one only with the benefit of the results from the first four. So at that point, we'll be positioned to maybe know what among these kinds of investments are most beneficial, least beneficial, most viable, least viable. And that'll position us to maybe combine some of them. It'll position us to maybe refine some of them. It'll position us to maybe pivot in another direction. By definition, and very much by design, we don't know what will go into that fifth portfolio, but sort of that's the philosophy here. Let's go to the next one. So in order to ground the rest of our discussion on this, I'd like to very briefly introduce some of the tools that we're going to be using for the analyses we're going to undertake during the remainder of Workstream 2. Specifically, we're going to be modeling electric and gas models with markets with Plexos and with GPCM, and using those two tools together. Both of them are pretty standard applications that we license for these types of studies and then customize with our own data. Both of those tools are in very widespread use for analyses of this type. I know we have seen Plexos mentioned and discussed in some of these proceedings, and I think probably some of the participants are familiar with GPCM as well. We've omitted here the hydraulic modeling tools that we used during workstream 1. We think, we obviously retain that capability as we go forward. We think we will be using it to verify some things, but because workstream 2 is primarily a cost-benefit type of study, that's not going to be the focus, so we're not focusing on it here. Let's go to the next one. So this is a sort of schematic representation of Plexos. I suspect most of the participants here are familiar with either Plexos or tools like Plexos. It's a chronological dispatch electric model. We've set our model up here populated with data sets mostly that align with the phase 2 work, which in turn mostly align with the most recent reference system plan. Where we diverge from those inputs, I think we have a pretty good reconciliation and pretty clear reporting of that from the November workshop and from some of the other materials that we put out there. As is the case with these kinds of tools, the inputs at a high level are assumptions regarding the generation fleet, assumptions regarding the configuration and size of the transmission grid, assumptions regarding electric demand over time and how all of these things are going to change over long periods. And we put all those and all the other factors that we see in this slide into the model. We turn the crank and we run it on an hourly basis for long periods, in this case, 10 or 20 years. And from that, we get a simulation of system dispatch that we think is generally pretty true to the actual operation of the system, from which we can also extract operational factors like the utilization of specific pieces of infrastructure, plants, transmission lines, things of that nature, the dispatch of plants, the economic performance of individual resources, and perhaps most importantly for us, the market prices and the emission rates and total emissions, which we'll be capturing and using to analyze the costs and the benefits from each program, each package of investments. I don't plan to sort of discuss Plexos in much greater depth than that because, again, my assumption is that folks are maybe familiar with this already. So let's flip to the next one and talk about GPCM a little bit. But that said, if there are more questions about Plexos at the end of the section, please don't hesitate. We're happy to answer any you may have. GPCM is perhaps less familiar to the participants here. And, summarized at a high level of abstraction, it can be thought of as the gas version of Plexos, insofar as we develop simulations of the gas market based on a number of fundamental inputs that we embed into the model with a high level of granularity, and we allow those inputs to change over time, either based on results or based on our assumptions. So, our inputs here that are most important include inputs regarding gas infrastructure, the configuration of the pipeline network in California and elsewhere, in gas storage. We have inputs regarding gas supply, production, and production capabilities that are very, very sort of narrowly differentiated by region and by type. We also have inputs regarding demand. We know sort of what expectations are regarding consumption from customers in California, from customers elsewhere. And we also have assumptions and inputs regarding reactions to how customer behavior would change in light of higher or lower prices. Formally put, we have sloped demand curves that have elasticity embedded in them that include over time the opportunity for customer behavior to change as market prices change. Let's go to the next one. So at the heart of GPCM, really, and at the heart of this type of modeling is the analysis of transportation economics, which is to say the modeling of how gas prices change regionally and locally based on the flows of gas from one point to another and the capability of the transmission system to move gas from here to there. In other words, much of what we do in GPCM is centered on the analysis of the economic value of what we call gas basis, which is differentiation between prices in one point and another. And to do that, we have a costing function that's embedded in GPCM, which is actually set up in this case as a discounting function, wherein we say that we have an understanding of what the value of gas transportation is to move across any piece of infrastructure under sort of unconstrained conditions. We have a general understanding of what that is, and that generally conforms to costs to some degree and maybe a function of transportation tariffs, but we can sort of observe what price spreads are from here to there under relatively benign conditions. We know that those price spreads change in response to changes in market dynamics. And we know the way that works is that as demand increases, the utilization of the gas system increases, and as system utilization increases, and as utilization especially becomes very high and starts to approach 100% across any path and across any sort of aggregation of paths to serve a demand center, we know the prices increase. And so what we can do is we can analyze over time how demand and transportation capacity and prices and price spreads interrelate, and we can turn those into a function, which is represented here in terms of a discount function, of how the value of moving across that piece of gas infrastructure can change over time. I think as we get through this, this might sort of make more sense to anyone to whom it does not yet. Flip forward one more. And so what we have in GPCM is we have all of these costing functions that are applied to all of these different segments of pipeline, of which there are a lot. We model the pipeline system with a great deal of granularity and a great deal of specificity. On the left side here, just as an example, you see our configuration of the Transwestern system, which for anyone generally familiar with it, sort of aligns with the tariff zones that are in use on that system. Each of those green dots represents a segment of pipeline, and we have that cost discounting function built into each of those segments. And then each of those segments also have other connections beyond their connections to other sections of the Transwestern pipeline. So here we've blown out the Blanco San Juan zone. For anyone familiar with the Transwestern system, this is basically our modeling of the Blanco hub, which is in San Juan County in northwestern New Mexico. So if you look, you see that the Blanco San Juan zone, this green circle in the center of the three that are aligned over on that right-hand graph, receives gas from the Colorado zone on Transwestern, can send gas onto the San Juan zone on Transwestern, and that's sort of, again, for anyone familiar, moving gas towards the Thorough compressor stations. And then these red and the yellow, the red squares and the yellow pentagons reflect connections to gas suppliers. In this case, gas supplies from conventional production and from coal bed methane, both of which are fairly expensive, and I'm not sure whether either of those are going to produce a lot, but that's where they could interconnect to Transwestern through gathering systems in and around New Mexico. And then we also have pipeline interconnects here at the Blanco hub that show that gas can come in from the Trans-Colorado system and from the El Paso system. Now, all of this is based on sort of the real world configuration of all of these systems. And so for all of these, we're going to have the transportation discounting function, we're going to have the capacity, the ability to, the physical capability to move the lines over the system. We're going to have the interconnects configured in ways that, again, should reflect real world. We're going to model the behavior of the suppliers based on how they've sort of behaved in the past. And if we put all this together, we should have a pretty good idea of the costs and the values to move gas from one part of Transwestern to another. And in this case, we can put all of those sorts of deliveries together with other deliveries to figure out what the value is of moving gas from supply areas into California. And let's talk about supply. Let's move forward one. So on the supply side, GPCM sort of, the important insights here, I think, are that we have very, very highly granular looks at production economics that are differentiated at a really, really fine level. And we have a couple sort of perspectives here that we can look at, and we do look at when we do this sort of modeling. So, on the left side, this is some output from a model that we had sitting around. Again, these are all just indicative for purposes of discussion. These are not the results we're going to be using in California. But what we can see here is that over time, there's a current expectation in this case that gas from the Marcellus shales, gas from the Utica shales, gas from the Haynesville shale will be increasing in market share, increasing in production, none of which is particularly surprising to anyone, I think. We have the capability to sort of drill down on that further. And the plot on the right here shows us forecast and historical production for all the Marcellus shale suppliers that are located in West Virginia. Not because there's anything special about them, but because it's a sort of nice example to show the level of granularity. And so what we have here generating these findings is we and the data supplier that we license for this purpose have gone through and have compiled a whole bunch of very, very detailed production data from state sources, in this case in West Virginia, showing how the producers in West Virginia have produced gas over time, how that production has related to things like pipeline capacity and things like prices. And from those, we've defined a whole bunch of relationships that roll up into a supply curve over time. In this case, a supply curve for production in West Virginia from the Marcellus Shale that is essentially a schedule over time of as prices increase, production will increase, as prices decrease, production will decrease, all within sort of definable bands that are based on the configuration of the system and the capability of the resources there. And all of these go into every simulation that we run in GPCM, along with the production profiles of all of the other gas suppliers in the model, to give us a good picture of wellhead prices elsewhere and sort of good outlooks on those key gas pricing indices that are relevant to supply area, like your Dominion South Points or like your Wajas or things like that. And so by putting those things together along with demand, we have really, really granular perspective on supply. We have a really, really granular perspective on transportation. And from that, we can get a pretty good outlook on delivered prices at various spots on the grid, including at the Socal border and the Socal City Gate. Let's flip forward one more. So this is the kind of analysis that we're going to undertake with this tool, where, imagine we had developed a forecast of the Socal City Gate price based on all of our business as usual assumptions, and that forecast was the gold line shown here. So what we would do is we would hold all of the variables that went into that forecast constant. And then we would make a change to correspond to one of the portfolios we're modeling. Say, for example, we would model the gas demand reduction portfolio through a reduction in gas demand. And we would run it again, holding everything else equal, and we would get a change in prices. In this case, a reduction in prices that would be the blue series here. And so from that, we can deduce savings for customers in the form of lower costs to gas utilities for consumption, and lower costs to electric generation, lower cost for electric generation lower cost for electric generation, which will translate to reduced energy costs. We're going to be doing this in both GPCM and in Plexos with every portfolio, and along the way, we're going to be tracking what the change in local prices are and what the benefits that arise from that are. Let's flip forward one more. So those benefits, of course, are only part of the equation here. We think all of the portfolios are likely to reduce local energy prices, which is to say, if you build all 4 portfolios of the things we looked at in that slide a little while ago, you would get a reduction in delivered prices. The question at hand is whether the cost to build each of those things is rationalized by the benefit. So the way we're going to do it is we're going to conduct financial analysis using a financial modeling tool that we have for this purpose that basically creates a series of cash flows for the customers that says we have an upfront investment, which is the cost to build each of these portfolios. And then we have these benefits that are going to shake out from the portfolios in the form of reduced energy prices and in the form of reduced emissions. And we'll see what the net present value is of each of the portfolios. And that should give us a useful basis to compare things on an apples to apples kind of standing. Let's go to the next one. And so to formalize work stream 2 into this series of steps, What we're going to do is we're going to start with those investment portfolios that are scaled appropriately to meet the shortfall. Again, these are solutions to the problem that can be built in the time available. Then we're going to conduct simulations of the markets to see what change compared to a business as usual outlook that includes Aliso would arise from building these portfolios. Then we're going to compare the benefits to the cost using the financial modeling tool. And that should support a rank ordering of each of these solutions on an NPV basis that should include all of the economic and the financial factors. And we hope that when those results are available, that will serve as interesting support for decision making by the policymakers. Let's flip to the next one. So that's workstream 2 in a very small nutshell. Questions and thoughts are very welcome.
Thank you, Matt. We are a bit behind schedule, so I wonder if we should hold questions later. There will be a general comment, public comment period at the end.
I can say that we are behind schedule based on the agenda, but we sort of reordered some of the things, so we're going to catch up to it in the next 2 sections, which are going to be shorter than we have blocked off for. So it only seems like we're behind schedule, or at least we're not nearly as far behind as it seems.
Okay, well, that's good to know. In that case, we can open it up for questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, or you can type questions into the chat box, and I will unmute you or read your question loud. Please keep your questions to no more than 3 minutes in the interest of time for each one. And please start by stating your name and your organization, if any. And give me a second to look you up. We have a question from Sarah Garrison for the Sierra Club in the chat box. Can you explain what emissions benefits he plans on including in the cost-benefit analysis? Are these RPS compliant benefits, health benefits, or something else?
So we're going to be, and I think maybe Venki can follow up on the response to this, but every time we run the model, specifically the electric model, we'll be capturing gas. We'll be capturing gas burns. We'll be capturing emissions from the electric grid. We will also be capturing gas consumption by the utilities in California, although we don't expect that to change much insofar as it serves core demand, except for the EE portfolio. But we'll be capturing it in either way. So with every iteration of the model and with the simulations we do to analyze each of the portfolios, we should be able to capture with precision all of the emissions that go into that, and we'll be measuring those and valuing those. I do not think we plan to turn that into an estimate of health benefits. I think we're going to be capturing the actual emissions themselves and then applying a cost function to that, a price to it basically, in order to quantify the benefit of the change when we reduce emissions, and then we will leave it to others to sort of translate that into health impacts. Before we move on to the next one, Venki, anything to add to that?
No, I think you captured it. On the electric side, for sure, we'll be able to extract the total emissions, notably CO2.
And we have a question from Susan Gorman Chang. Are you considering the externalities to Los Angeles in the state of California for using natural gas as opposed to solar, battery, wind combination? Externalities are actual costs and can be calculated. and she includes a couple links here in the chat. One from 2 Green Energy, one from irena.org.
So I think probably not. I do not have those studies at my fingertips, so I'm going to have to speculate as to what's in those. I think probably not, but I think our study helps advance that discussion nonetheless. Our mandate here is to sort of focus on these energy operational issues, and that's what we're experts at, right? So I'm not sure anyone would even want us trying to calculate externalities. But we do plan to publish a whole bunch of data, a whole bunch of results, and we plan to do it with lots of granularity and lots of transparency in a way that will be very, very specifically designed to allow folks to take our results and conduct further analysis with them. So to the extent that decision makers and policymakers want to sort of rely on our modeling to better understand externalities or other impacts, we think we'll be providing the basis to do it. And we don't think that any of those calculations that we're sort of intentionally deciding not to do now, none of those would actually impact the sorts of simulations that we're undertaking now. So we don't think we lose any value. We don't think there's any sort of analytical opportunity cost to this approach. And we do think that we're sort of facilitating other folks to do exactly the kinds of calculations that I think we're talking about.
And I believe, Jason Egan, you have your hand up. I am unmuting you. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello, Jason.
Perfect. I have a couple questions. I'll try to keep it within the 3-minute window.
Jason, you are extremely quiet. I wonder if you could speak up.
Oh, sorry. Let me move my microphone and see if that's any better. Any better?
Yes.
Perfect. I had a couple questions. I will try to be quick given that 3-minute window. On slides 10 to 14, you talk a bit about GPCM and the upstream analysis. How does GPCM determine the likelihood that gas will be available at the California border? Or does it assume that gas will always be available? Is there some sort of an analysis that goes into the likelihood that gas will be there when you need it?
Yes, and well, yes and no. Yes, there is. We're doing a great deal of analysis about gas that's going to be available at the border, and in fact, that is going to be a big part of the discussion once Tim takes over. So, if I could indulge your patience, could you let Tim talk through that? But let's certainly not end this session with any questions you have about it sort of unresolved. So let's put a pin in that, and we'll circle back if you have questions when Tim's done. We can come back to this. Jason, you there? If you're still talking, you're muted.
Sorry, I had Jason muted. I thought you were turning it over to Tim.
No. Later in today's presentation.
Oh, I see.
So, Jason, now that you're unmuted, is that okay? Can we pause that for the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to hold that. And then if I have additional questions, should I wait until others go so we see if there's still time, or should I put them into the chat box? Just want to make sure that I have an opportunity to ask them, but without kind of disrupting the flow of whatever you have planned, Eileen.
If you have another one or two, let it rip. Okay,
perfect. Looking at the net benefit slide on 15, do you know what discount rate you plan to use? What discount rate you're planning to use to calculate the net present value?
No, I do not. Conceptually, I do know it's not going to be like a company WACC. We're going to be developing a discount rate sort of from a societal perspective. And we're going to be looking at some of the available research to see if there's a consensus as to what it is, but we don't know yet. Okay. And it's one of those topics that comments and thoughts would be very welcome in your comments after this.
Perfect. Thank you. And then last question. The gas market model on slide 15, it looks like you're going to run that on a monthly basis. Are there any concerns that that'll end up muting the benefit for gas solutions? You know, a lot of weather events occur over several days or a week. Curious if alternatively FTI is considering a daily gas model that might mimic gas price spikes on extreme weather events and translate those into benefits as opposed to looking at it on a monthly basis.
So it's a really good question. We are analyzing what the magnitude of that impact is now. We're not going to be conducting long-run daily modeling in the simulation tool, just because doing so sort of requires an overlay of all kinds of arbitrary assumptions. We say that, you know, on a Wednesday in February in 2038, it's going to be cold, but on the Thursday it'll be mild, things like that, which are just kind of not supportable. But what we might do and what we're looking at is taking the results of our monthly prices and overlaying daily shaping. And at some point, we have to sort of do something along these lines anyway, because Plexos models things on a daily and an hourly basis. So one way or the other, we have to take our monthly modeling tool and we have to use it to develop daily gas inputs. And I think at the very least, what we'll be doing is we'll be applying sort of daily shaping to the daily gas prices. The degree to which that reflects kind of extreme events or unusual events is something that we're still working through, that we don't yet know. We might come back with a finding on that sort of the data clearly supports one approach or the other. We might come back with saying we don't think it's impactful or that it is, or we might come back with a proposed approach that we think works. So we're thinking about it and we don't know yet.
Thank you. And I'm going to take another question from a raised hand. Isam Najim, you are up next.
Thank you very much. Isam Najim, resident of Porter Ranch. I have two questions for you, if you don't mind. Can you go to slide number 6? And can you help me understand a little bit, if you can elaborate on the times of those power shortfalls? Are these summer demand? Is this winter minimum EG demand? And does it include LADWP gas demand or excludes LADWP? Can you help me understand this?
Yes, and I'm going to let my colleagues also jump in to clarify anything that I miss. Eileen, if you can unmute Tim and Venki. This is wintertime demand. And so what we're modeling here is we're modeling the most constrained period on the system. You know, one starts to think about electric reliability and one automatically thinks of sort of summer demand and high demand conditions. In reality, the period on which the system is most constrained, has the least slack, is during the winter. And that's because even though electric demand is lower and demand for gas by electric generation is lower, demand for heating is much higher, obviously, than in the summer. And the combination actually creates a greater constraint on the system than does just having to serve electric demand in the summertime. So all of our studies are sort of oriented around this critical day or critical hour that happens to occur in the wintertime. That's not an assumption we made, that's a finding of ours from the first phase. And then so what we do is we modeled those days and this day, and what it is, it's the 1 in 10 peak day based on the demand profile from the California gas report. We model this day and we go hour by hour, and we find that in each of the hours we have, or in many of the hours, I guess I should say, we have an inability to serve all of the needs simultaneously. And then our peak hour, our most critical hour, is the hour in which the gap between what we can serve and what we do serve is greatest. That gap happens in the evening in both of these years, having to do with sort of the interplay between supply, demand, and the fall off of intermittent resources during the day, basically along the duck curve. As the solar drops out, we have to rely more on the remaining generation fleet, and that's where the biggest shortfall arrives.
Sure. And does it include LADWP demand?
Venki, can you remind me of the answer to that one? I don't recall if these numbers include LADWP demand.
Yes. It's California. It has all the balancing authorities.
Okay.
In WEC. So
Okay.
LA is a clear balancing authority that is included. And the gas demand, I think, let Tim speak to that. It's all whatever gas is connected to the Aliso system, I believe. But Tim, you can clarify what gas demand is included.
Sure. No, that's exactly right. It's all of the gas demand that's connected to the Socal gas system that's reported in the California gas report. So all the core demand, non-core demand, that type of thing is pulled directly out of the California gas report. So that's the demand that's served plus the generation demand.
Okay. And my second question, if you can go to slide 15. And I appreciate that your approach to this is on a system-wide basis, and you're looking at the benefits under a standard analysis scenario of changing power portfolios and where the costs are and where the benefits are. But there's something unique about this exercise. This is an exercise about closing a specific facility. And so will you include any benefits to that closure under the benefits pool, such as residual value of any facilities or components, as well as I mentioned in the comments on workshop 1, any value to closing the facility that translates into a benefit to public health from that action?
Yeah, these are good questions. And again, someone asked me this during the workstream 1 workshop. I think it may have been you. And I think at the time, I sort of closed off that discussion and said, no, we're not trying to capture any of the health benefits. And I've thought about that since, and that remains very much the answer here. Within the 4 corners of our study, we're not trying to analyze the health benefits that could emerge. But we don't think that anything about our study prevents anyone else from doing that. We think there are almost certainly better qualified than us to do those calculations. We're energy people, not sort of public health folks. And so we would leave that to the experts. And so what we will come out of our analysis will be sort of the all-in net cost to build some of these things, net of the gains and losses that we're talking about here on this slide. And then if there's a perspective or if there's a finding that there's additional incremental benefit of closing Aliso beyond that, that can be sort of added onto the end results in ways that I think are pretty straightforward and I think still support decision making by the policymakers. So no, we're not trying to capture anything with health benefits, but I think that's still compatible with what we're doing here. And then very quickly, regarding the residual value of the facilities, we are going to be looking at what we're calling regulatory gaps. If we thought and conclude that it was necessary to provide the owner of Aliso Canyon with some kind of salvage benefit or something like that, then that would be a cost that nets against these portfolios, I think. But we haven't made a determination there yet.
Well, then I'll just leave it with a comment. When you present the cost-benefit analysis to the decision makers, if you're not going to monetize some of the benefits because you believe they're not part of your scope, at least you can leave a space for them and say, there are these other benefits that have not been monetized under this exercise.
I think that's a really good insight, and we'll be very, very careful to sort of lay out what our results are and are not, and sort of how they can fit into the broader discussion. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
And Matthew, if I could add, and Dr. Najan, thank you for your comments. I think this is obviously something I've been thinking a lot about. And one thought just is the health benefits, not just to the localized community as one question, the health benefits of all of these portfolio investments that we may end up picking from. As an example, we don't currently quantify the benefits of localized air pollution from gas generation. There is quantification of the greenhouse gas element, but there are, just to say that I'm looking for input from folks for how we can capture some of these health benefits throughout the portfolio and throughout the beneficiaries, that not just we shouldn't be too narrow in how we can think creatively about where those opportunities are. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Matt, I see Todd has pulled up the screen for the next section. I believe we have around 10 questions waiting between hands up and in the chat. And I'm guessing that we may need to move on before we're able to answer all those. But again, there will be time later in the presentation. And Matt, what do you think on time?
I think that's fine. We've done most of the lifting so far, but I think it probably makes sense to sort of preserve the schedule by moving through the first couple of portfolios, and then we'll circle back for more questions.
Sounds good. Go ahead.
Okay, good. So with that, that's the background, and I do look forward to coming back to the additional questions. I've been also asked to cover two of our simpler portfolios, which makes a lot of sense because I'm going to leave the complex ones to the experts. So these should be pretty quick. The first one is our demand side gas portfolio, where we're going to reduce natural gas consumption by enough to close the gap. Todd, you want to flip forward one? And so we think that's most likely based on the existing EE program at Socalgas. These are recent budgets that were filed by the utility that show that, you know, on average reductions are 5 or 6 BCF per year. Achievement varies from this somewhat, but the order of magnitude is about right. This is to say that it's going to be a pretty significant leap to increase the magnitude to close these shortfalls, but we think it's interesting, we think it's useful, and we think it'll sort of inform thinking about how we can make investments on the demand side that help facilitate things like this. Let's go forward one. And the nice thing is we have a lot of data regarding these programs, just given the granularity with which they're reported on in California, which is really great. We can see from the information that's publicly available a couple interesting trends already. Most of the savings each year are sort of concentrated in a small handful of programs. We are analyzing how those programs scale individually. We're thinking through whether it's reasonable to take the EE budgets and the EE programs in their entirety and scale them, whether we should be thinking about individual measures, whether we should be looking at sort of the costs and the benefits analyses and using that to inform our decisions. And we would be very, very eager for comments and thoughts about sort of how we should be thinking about this and whether there's any data that we should be paying particularly close attention to. Let's go to the next one. Now, one area that I know is of great interest, but that I do not expect to comprise a big part of the gas demand study is building electrification. And that's just because of the simple fact that we know building electrification creates lots and lots of useful benefits. And we know that it really advances decarbonization, and that aligns with AB 3232. The problem that we have with electrification for this particular application is just the very simple fact that, you know, we have a shortfall of electric gen during those critical hours, and building electrification necessarily increases electric demand. So for purposes of the specific problem that we have before us, we're robbing Peter to pay Paul a little bit in the way that it seems to us. NREL put out a very useful study on this in January, this electrification futures study that highlights this dynamic for us nicely. That study shows that there are lots and lots of benefits associated with electrification, but that peak day reductions maybe are not one of them. And what we're showing here is we're showing these two plots that indicate that, you know, as RCI gas gen or gas consumption falls, the amount of capacity that you need, the amount of electric gen that you need increases. So again, if we apply this to the Aliso Canyon problem, we would be saying we'd be closing the gas gap while simultaneously widening the electric gap. And some of the ratios that are embedded in the NREL findings suggest that that wouldn't be very, very workable. Now, we recognize that there are sort of lots and lots of simplifications to looking at it this way. The NREL data is not California specific. We are not aware of a data set that would allow us to make this comparison for California. And so again, this is another one that this is very much a straw man, that we're thinking right now that we're not going to have this as part of our mix, but that we want thoughts and comments and reactions to that idea. Let's go to the next one. And so I'm not going to read these, but everyone will have access to them, and I think they might be in a document earlier. But so in that same vein, these are some of those very specific ideas and very specific areas where we'd be really, really grateful for thoughts from the participants. And you know, we'll take those on board as we finalize things. And that's in addition to any other issues sort of that folks want to comment on about this portfolio. Let's go to the next one. Eileen, I leave it to you whether we should pause now or whether we should go through the next section very briefly and then pause for more questions.
I'm going to suggest going through this section and then pausing after the next section.
Good. All right. So let's flip one more. And so this is the simplest portfolio of all. Let's go ahead to the next slide. This is the electric supply side portfolio where we're going to take certain elements from the RSP and just scale them up. The IRP and the RSP that comes from it envisions the addition of a certain amount of new generation over time. We're going to take those additions and we're just going to scale them up pro rata, assume that the mix that shakes out of that study is going to be the same mix going forward, scale it up to meet the shortfall for each of 27 and 35, and then analyze that in Plexos and in GPCM. There will be lots of detail, there will be lots of reporting, but conceptually that one is fairly straightforward. Let's go to the next slide. And so that is the end of my presentation of the Workstream 2 overview plus those two portfolios. And so I guess before we break, questions on any of the above.
So starting at the top, let's see, we have a raised hand from Tyson Siegel. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, and please remember to identify your affiliation, if any.
Oh, yes. My name is Tyson Siegel. I'm with the Protect Our Communities Foundation. And I had a couple questions on the first part of the presentation, just to cover the one that I think has a lot of impact is the minimum local generation measures. When you are showing the shortfall in your analysis thus far, do the shortfall assume that minimum local generation measures are activated, and even with the minimum local generation that you end up with a shortfall?
I am going to refer that one to Venki for some of the nuts and bolts. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to refer that one to Venki now. I'm going to ask, please hold that one as well, and we'll come back to that when Venki's talking more about the electric modeling. I think that's probably most efficient.
Okay.
So if you wouldn't mind.
Sure. And so I have one other one about the IRP portfolio. And so there were a couple of newly released documents that I think will probably have an impact on the analysis on the IRP portfolio. One was a ELCC study that was completed by FTI Consulting, and it was showing that ELCC for hybrid projects, wind and battery or solar and battery, that the ELCC would reach 97%. So wind and solar is likely to very soon have a much higher firm capacity than it has in the past. And so that's the first question on the IRP. Have you taken a look at that? Have you considered that in your IRP portfolio?
So we haven't considered it yet. The IRP portfolio, it's an in-place chicks right out of the IRP. And part of our mandate and part of our approach has been to try to be sure that we're consistent with the inputs that were used for that study, which were also the inputs that were used in phase 2. We think that makes a lot of sense. Now, we have diverged in some places for what we've called sort of known and measurable adjustments for real, clear, and impactful changes to the markets that we think have emerged since those assumptions were formulated that we think are pretty obvious and clear. So all that's to say that we are in the process of sort of going through top to bottom and thinking about all of the assumptions, including the operational characteristics of all the new infrastructure, and trying to measure sort of every instance where we have new and updated data, including, say, for example, these changes to ELCC, whether the change is sort of generally a consensus view, whether it's significant and whether it's so significant that we ought to make it one of our sort of known and measurable adjustments, or whether whether we should just sort of conform to the phase 2 IRP inputs. All of that's to say that we don't have a decision yet, but when we come up with our results, we'll be sure to report that and any other sort of key changes to the inputs. And I'm hearing a big emphasis not coming from me. Maybe once.
Okay, thank you so much. And there's just one last item that I wanted to point you in the direction of, which is a new ruling that came out in the IRP with 7,500 megawatts proposed firm capacity, NQC capacity, that might be interesting to consider and take a look at for the
It is interesting. That is certainly on our radar. If I could impose on you, Tyson, when you file written comments after that, if you do, could you please be sure just to mention these as sort of issues we should consider? They are on our radar. We are taking these things down, but this helps us sort of, this back and forth, if it's on paper, helps us with the paper trail as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And we have a raised hand from a Jim Caldwell. Please go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Jim Caldwell. I'm with the Center for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Technology. I have 3 questions, one on each of the topics we've talked to so far. First is on the modeling platform, and it's the gas side. And I'm curious as to whether you are including the, I'll call it capitalized maintenance expenditures that arose first out of San Bruno and then Aliso, and then now the desert pipelines that are adding considerable rate base to the rate base from, on the transmission system from the border into the city gate. It's already impacted the basis differential in PG&E service territory and is about to in Socal Gas. And I'm curious as to whether you, excuse me, have explicitly included those expenditures into your model.
We have not. Be sort of eager for commentary in comments as to recommendations and thoughts on sort of what the most appropriate way to do that might be. I would add to that, and I think we circled back to it at the end there, that we would only be including adders, and really what we'd be doing would be changing the discounting function in ways that we think sort of comport to new relationships between prices. We'd only be doing that insofar as they impact the wholesale sort of market prices. Changes to rates and changes to sort of customer costs are kind of separate from the model. The model is designed to essentially forecast spot prices. So I think
these would be spot city gate prices. They would not, I mean, of course they would flow through into retail rates, but these are spot city gate prices, not commodity prices.
Right. So insofar as
So
insofar
they're
as these changes,
wholesale. They're clearly wholesale, is what I'm
yes.
saying.
Right. So insofar as these changes affect it, we would be working those in. We have not done that yet, but
Okay, all right. We'll provide comments.
We
Then
appreciate
my second question is on the gas demand side.
Yeah.
And I'm struck by, you talked about energy efficiency in buildings, but you didn't talk about any issues with industrial demand. And when you look, the industrial demand in Socalgas is almost exclusively either enhanced oil recovery or petroleum refining. And both of those sectors are clearly going to be impacted over this time frame as some of the other, electrification or whatever. Or you could certainly see some of the demonstration projects that are going on now in petroleum refining to use green hydrogen from surplus renewables to replace steam methane reforming in the petroleum refining industry. And if you look at those numbers, just those numbers in and of themselves are sufficient to fill the gap that you have here if you got ambitious. So I'm just saying it's a big thing in this time frame that I think you need to look at in addition to energy efficiency and building decarbonization.
I really appreciate that perspective, and I would really appreciate to hear everyone's thoughts on how we do that. And this is one of those things that I think we're going to be grappling with for the entirety of our project. We are
right. I agree. Right.
We're looking forward, right? And we have all these sort of new and novel technologies, and it's really hard to sort of pick the horse races about which of those are likely to be commercialized. And so we're constantly sort of going back and forth between how we can work those in while simultaneously sort of conforming with what we'll call quote unquote official studies that are out there that we're trying to rely on, and not imposing our own perspectives and not, just picking winners and losers among technology. So that's not a very direct answer, but it's something that's very much on our radar that we're working through and would be eager for thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this is one that hasn't shown up in the California gas report yet, but it's huge. It's enough to make a difference for this study, and it's in the right time frame. So I just put that one. And then on the IRP slide that you showed, you talk about the RSP for the Cal ISO Balancing Authority. I think you also have to use the IRP for LADWP, including Glendale, since both of those utilities have IRPs that essentially show zeroing out in-basin gas consumption in this same time frame. And those are clearly within the Aliso footprint. So I think you just have to add the LADWP IRP to the RSP from Edison or the CAISO in this case.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a good thought. I think we may have that already insofar as when we run Plexos, we run sort of the entire.
Well, it's not in Plexos. I mean, when I asked that question back in November, they said that for LADWP, they used what was in the WEC anchor data set, and none of that is in that data set yet. It's now public. They just had a big rollout last week. There is a lot of, it's in the, for example, it's in the CEC IPER forecast. It's not necessarily in the gas forecast yet. So it's one of these emerging trends in this time frame that, you need to take, because again, in and of itself, that's 2,800 megawatts of electric generation that, to the extent that those IRPs are realized, that's all or most of your shortfall out in that time frame.
Yeah, no, it's good. And we will take a look. And it's one of those It's another one of those sort of emerging questions that we're sort of trying to, I'm trying to figure out whether there's been a lot emerging, yeah, whether just a lot emerging lately or.
Don't know some of this stuff that's emerging, and I appreciate that. And by the way, I just want to say I really do appreciate the presentation and your work on the modeling and the modeling platform and how you're going about doing it. I think mostly it's just getting the scenarios right and inclusive enough. I think we finally, for the first time in 4 years, got a modeling platform and a workflow that's going to give us the answers that we need. So thanks for showing up.
Well, thank you, Jim. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And I think we're going to need to move on to other questions. We have one here from the chat from earlier. Roger Schiffman, representing Turn, says, since you are evaluating a transmission option, is Plexos being modeled using nodal representation of transmission or zonal?
The short answer is zonal. The longer answer, I think, is going to be covered when Venki Venkashwara walks through the transmission portfolio later on. So I'm going to table that one again. And if we don't answer any questions that the stakeholders have, please do raise them again after Venki has his section.
Thank you. And we have a raised hand from Matt Picuco. Matt, I am scrolling for you. There you are.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, this question, thank you very much. This question goes back to what was said in Matt, the other Matt's opening comments. Said something to the effect that that facility is absolutely needed for gas and electric. But have you, in all your modeling and assumptions, figured out what would be needed if that facility is suddenly shut down with just about zero notice due to things like earthquake that sits actually that facility, the wells bisect the San Jose fault line. So say that fault severed one or several or many earthquakes, or brush fire rolled through there and damaged that facility where it needed to be shut down, or if the facility was ordered shut down by a government agency or the governor of California for, say, up to 2 years due to the health damage it's causing, as already has happened in the real world. And especially if this happened during peak demand. Have you figured out what would be needed?
No, we haven't tried to answer that question, and we haven't. We have tried to answer the question, what would happen if Aliso were shut down in 2027 for whatever reason it was shut down, and sort of no other changes beyond the ones that are currently expected were made. And so, well, that's it. That's the only answer we have, except for the fact that because the market's changing over time, the answer would necessarily be different than the one we capture for 27, but I don't know what the answer would be.
Okay, and the second half of the question would be back to your opening comments. You say the facility is absolutely necessary, but I'm sure you were aware that it was shut down for 2 years. So how was that possible if you say that it can't be done because it's absolutely necessary to have that facility without all the massive infrastructure?
Well, I'm not sure I'm necessarily qualified to answer that one. What I can say is that what we're modeling is the specifics of 27. We're modeling it under sort of a high demand condition, right? We're using, as we talked about in November, the 1 in 10 peak demand day, which is not the demand profile that one would expect, well, any more frequently than once in 10 years. And so that may well have something to do with it. As far as any additional remedial measures that were taken by the California Commission, I could not say. But I can say that I am very confident that under the conditions that we modeled, the system is reliant on Aliso. That confidence is bolstered by the findings from the CPUC and its team during phase 2, And so I can appreciate sort of your perspective of where you're coming from with the question, but I don't think we can infer from sort of specific outcomes in the past that in the future, we can simply hope that that history repeats itself.
So isn't that a big part of reliability, though? If this place can be shut down and actually has been shut down, but for only one reason in the past, it was shut down for health reasons. Doesn't that fit into the reliability question that could be shut down tomorrow?
Yeah, I mean,
reliability issue there.
yeah, and reliability is all we're analyzing. So, I mean, I would say, I don't know if it can be shut down tomorrow, but I do know that it can't be shut down for 27 under the conditions that we modeled, strictly from a reliability perspective, right? We haven't even pivoted to touch economics yet. We're just saying, is there enough gas to serve all the loads? And we find that sort of within the framework that we have, it isn't. We could at some point sort of try to hash out what the differences are between market conditions that we're modeling and market conditions that happened in the past and market conditions right now. But I'm not sure that that would necessarily sort of lead to an answer. If you say, I can retire the facility tomorrow without impacts, that doesn't mean you could retire the facility in the future, or that you'd be okay operating without the facility under sort of high demand conditions that emerge only once in a while. I think the commissioner might have something to add.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. And I just really want to appreciate the question and just also thinking through how that period can inform this exercise of, not just an exercise, but this pathway. And so, you know, just a thought, and really look for further thoughts and comments on this, is us doing the work in understanding what the circumstances were during that period and what our assumptions are for this pathway, these portfolio studies, to understand what the difference is. So be it obviously, you know, maybe we had a fairly warm winter, those winters. I'm trying to recall back actually, and I think we had access, even though it was, as you say, shut down, there, I believe was still allowed about 15 BSF in there. But I want to just acknowledge your question, go back and really look at what the circumstances were during that time and how they relate to what we're assuming as kind of our baseline here. And I think that will at least inform us in terms of knowing if there's a further gap that we need to account for, or if there is an assumption, you know, a further assumption that we need to re-examine. So I hope that makes sense, but I think I'll certainly take back your valid point here. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have a couple other hands raised from folks who have not yet asked questions. So I have a hand raised from Pamela Dreyfus. You are unmuted.
Yes, hi, good afternoon. I pretty much had the same question that the former questioner, I believe his name was Matt, had. And I won't ask it again, but it seems quite clear that the Aliso Canyon facility is not needed because it was shut down for 2 years. And given the fact that, you know, demand for gas seems to be going down or is going down, and that the demand for solar and wind is going up, I just wonder how those contradictions around your modeling shortfalls, I mean, how it seems to me that there's some kind of a flaw in the modeling that is preferring that the gas company continues and that the shareholders make money. I'm sorry to say. I mean, I appreciate, you know, that you're all doing your job given whatever data you have, but there's there's something wrong with the modeling. Clearly, if the Aliso Canyon was closed for 2 years, and that's already a while ago, how can we see a demand? I mean, how can we see a shortfall then coming in the future if we went without it for 2 years? It just doesn't make common sense. And that's really my question and my comment.
Well, I appreciate that comment, and I'm going to echo the commissioner's sentiment that it's a totally fair question, and I think one that we should sort of run to ground. I think the answer is going to be something along the lines of that the conditions that we're assuming in the future are sort of going to shake out to be more extreme than had been observed in the past, and that there will be other changes in market conditions that give us this answer in light of the one we had in the past, which is to say that, you know, if in the past we had been reliant on a limited or entirely closed Aliso at some point, and the very high demand conditions that we're envisioning for our modeling were to emerge, that I think we might have had problems that we were fortunate not to have. That's just speculation on my part. That's not just, and I think so what we're taking from this is that we're going to have to just make sure that as we go forward, when we have results, we reconcile those two sets of conditions and explain exactly what you're finding to be a contradiction here, in a way that sort of points to the difference between the two and how we can say it's needed in the future when it seems like, at sometimes at least, it wasn't completely needed in the past. So I think we'll take that on board, and I think when we next have sort of content in front of the group, in terms of our probably written documents, I think we'll see some of that in there, and I hope it answers the question.
We have one more raised hand, and that is Norm, who is someone who has not yet asked a question. We will get to others later. We now have Norm Peterson.
Thank you, Eileen. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Matt, first of all, regarding the last question, the commission specifically found in another investigation 2 or 3 years ago, Leanne Randolph was the lead commissioner, the Aliso Canyon was not shut down. It was available as an asset of last resort under the Aliso Canyon withdrawal protocol. And it actually isn't too hard to see what the impacts were, because every year the Energy Division staff under Gene Spencer has put together what I think are just excellent analyses in their so-called winter look-back reports for 2017, 2018, 2019. They've been doing it annually. They also do summer look-back reports, and you can see from the look-back reports what the performance has been during each of those winters. So I would refer you to the Energy Division staff's look-back reports. But I do have just a couple of questions, Matt. You made a very pregnant comment when you were discussing slide 6 on the resource gaps in your opening presentation, and you said that these numbers that you present as resource gaps, and we learned from your response to Isam Najm that these are supposed to be peak hour numbers. You said that these could change because you were making some adjustments, and I thought you were going to say they would come down, but you said no, these could increase, your adjustments could increase the resource gap. Was that something you were going to cover, or is that still coming up from Vinky or Tim?
It's something Tim's going to cover. And so very specifically, and Norm, I know you were involved in these discussions during phase 2. There may be reason to change the receipt point utilization assumption. There may be reason to change the inventory assumption in Aliso that we model, which changes the withdrawal capability. But I don't want to ruin the surprise or Tim's fun, so I'm going to let him walk you through it shortly, if you wouldn't mind tabling that for a bit.
I just want to make sure we didn't miss it. And that's another really quick question about slide 25. This is the IRP mix. You have wind, battery, demand response, total. where is solar photovoltaics? Are you assuming that batteries subsume solar photovoltaics because they're hybrid facilities, or where's solar fit in?
That's basically how it's reported here. A lot of the batteries are PV plus batteries, and we've just kind of glommed them together here. We can make sure when we report this going forward, we break that out.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you.
Matt,
And we do-
actually, can I maybe,
Yes, go
sorry, Eileen, just want to make sure to Norman's question on assumptions, because one of the things that I appreciate you pointing out here on this section of slides is this study that you're utilizing, a national NREL study on the electrification, not necessarily, I'm realizing my camera's off, sorry. Not necessarily solving the problem, because you're assuming with the NREL study that the gas, that the generation would be gas generation. And I do think, I think that is, I appreciate you pointing it out. I think to Norman's question, this is another, it is an input that can lead to a different result. And certainly I'm interested in folks' comments on this, because I don't believe our portfolio on the generation side looks like the national one. And I think particularly in years 27 and beyond, they're definitely not going to look like the national one, if, of course, unless we get some federal requirements in place. But, you know, and that's just to say, like, taking the IRP mix here, that I'm interested to see folks' thoughts and input on if there's a way to kind of address your concern, Matt, that's brought forward through the study, versus some approach that is contingent on a cleaner generation source. So yes, it only makes sense to electrify if that new electric usage is based on a non-gas generation. So anyhow, I just want to make sure that was highlighted for folks, and mostly in response to Norman, your question on what those differences are. That's a big difference that I see, and that I would love some input on. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. I would too. I would just add to sort of that thinking that, so I think we do assume that the incremental generation would be non-gas. The problem that we're having is that without Aliso, we run short of gas. Some of the gas-fired generators can't be served, and so what happens is we have a generation shortfall. We call it, right. We don't have enough megawatts putting out or enough megawatt hours. So if we electrify something, we reduce gas demand, right? So that solves our problem. But to electrify, we now need more electricity. And so that exacerbates our electric gen problem. And even if we assume, which we are, I think, for the most part, even if we assume that the new supplies of electricity are clean sources, we're concerned that you're just moving the problem from one bucket to another. So that is the very specific issue that I would love to hear input from the participants on. And if there's data available that's California specific, would be very, very eager to see it, because this is an important dynamic. And right now we feel like we just don't have the granularity to analyze it and sort of give it its due.
Yeah, now, and I appreciate that dynamic, and I would just not, you know, I would go into that discussion really, because very much so a finding may be that instead of 4,700 megawatts for 2027, if we have an electrification component, we would need, you know, 5,500 megawatts of this clean electrification, excuse me, clean generation. So I don't think it is a zero sum. I think it's a little more dynamic personally, but this is why I'd like to hear from folks.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
I think that's a valuable food for thought, and I'm noting that there are some more questions in the chat, but we are about half an hour behind where we were scheduled to be. I wonder if we can manage without a break as folks are at home and can move and stretch around and move around and stretch, and maybe we move on and hold the remaining questions and any further discussion on past topics such as we just had until after the next presentations. Matt, does that make sense on your end?
It's okay with me if it's okay with Tim, who's up next.
Make that work.
Well, in that case, Tim, I think it's all yours.
All right. Well, I'll just jump in then. So, Todd, you've got the slides. Okay. Yeah. What we wanted to jump into here is the gas transmission portfolio portion of the study. And the gas transmission portfolio portion of the study will go through the possibility of replacing Aliso Canyon by expanding and or revitalizing the gas transmission network to bring in enough gas to offset the loss of supply that came from the Aliso facility. And you can see from this map, the first thing that we're going to look at is restoration of the northern zone of the Socal system back to the original 1590 million cubic feet a day of gas capacity into the area. As we look at this, and we'll do the economics and compare it to the other portfolio options, as Matt mentioned at the beginning of the study. But as we started looking at this in the context of our work stream 2 and starting getting ready to get our hands dirty moving forward with this, a couple of assumptions jumped out at us that we really need to kind of circle back and make sure that we're in agreement with the group, and that whether these assumptions that were used in the phase 2 analysis are still valid moving forward with the phase 3 analysis. So I think that's most of what we'll be discussing today with the transmission portfolio are these assumptions and current status and where we might go with those. So I think we can jump to the next page. Okay, the first assumption is the receipt point utilization. And back within the phase 2 proceeding, when the scenarios framework was developed and the beginning of that proceeding, there was a lot of work put in amongst the stakeholders and with the CPUC to determine the correct receipt point utilization assumption that should be used within the various reliability assessments of peak day demand on the system. And what was ultimately decided by the group and was to select an RPU assumption of 85%. So what that means is that the assumption was embedded in the models that if you looked at the full capacity of the Socal gas system to bring supplies in from the pipeline interconnects at the state border, they used 85% of the capacity in the northern and southern zones, bringing that gas into the state. And the reason it was used at 85% rather than 100% of capacity was to offset these 3 items that you see on the page here. The first was to have a tolerance for forecasting error, and that is a consistent thing that occurs on lots of systems around the country. People, a forecast of demand is generally cannot be exact with actual demand. So you put a little bit of tolerance or for forecasting error in there. The next is as protection against outages on the Socal gas system, which have happened a few times over the past few years. And then third, it was developed as an offset to potential outages of upstream pipeline capacity, bringing gas to the state, or upstream supply disruptions, gas supply freeze-offs, force majeures, losses due to hurricane storms, all sorts of things that can come in. So all those factors were bundled together, and the group decided that an 85% receipt point utilization was enough to protect against lost any of these potential disruptions in supply on the Socalgas system. So with that as background, we can then kind of jump into where we stand now. And if we go to the next slide. And this is specifically a question with relation to this great gas transmission investment portfolio. And the reason it's a question is that 85% that was utilized in phase 2 and that was agreed by the stakeholders was that 85% reflected, as I said on the other page, all of these different factors. And it was kind of a bundled approach. You throw everything in the bucket, you come up with 85%, and everybody was comfortable that you covered all those issues. And now we jump into these potential investment portfolios, and one of them is to enhance and restore the Socalgas system and then add capacity to that system. So if you have a 85%, for example, receipt point utilization, and you have that assumption embedded in your analysis, and then you go to expand the pipeline system, the Socalgas pipeline system, well, that lower percentage that's meant to accommodate supply failures upstream of the state border in some respect, you can expand the Socal system all day long, but you're not going to change the amount of gas that's going to come to the state border if that's the issue. So when we look at it that way, we realize that while the bundled approach may work if you know what the portfolio looks like and you know what the operating conditions look like, that 85% bundled approach doesn't really work if you're going to be expanding the gas transmission portfolio. So what you're going to see on this page is that what we're going to suggest is that for all of the portfolios where we leave the gas transmission system alone, and we're not suggesting an expansion of the gas transmission system, we're going to suggest just leave the 85% alone, be consistent with what we've done in the past, and it should probably hold for moving forward. With respect to the gas transmission investment portfolio, we're going to say that we think we should do something different. And so what we want to do is take a look at something that accommodates on-system forecasting error and possibly outages on the Socalgas system. And we'll deal with upstream failures, i.e. pipeline capacity upstream of the state, and or upstream supply failures in a separate area. We won't deal with those here. So that's kind of what this slide's all about. The first one goes through the bullets on the gas transmission portfolio. The second is the suggestion that what we're going to suggest is that we raise that RPU for the gas transmission portfolio. As I said, the 85% was low because it covered those upstream issues. So if we take the upstream issues out of the equation, we think it should be raised. We're going to suggest raising it to 95% based on the use of the system over the last 3 years, and we'll show that in a minute. And the fact that the Socalgas system would be restored and more robust as we move forward. And then in the bottom, as I said here, we don't suggest changing anything in the remaining investment portfolios. So let's jump to the next page. And what this page points out is the actual receipt point utilization over the past few years. And what you can see is that in the last 3-4 years, the receipt point utilization has been generally increasing, and the maximum utilization, which typically occurs on a peak demand day, is well above 95%. You can see the 2017-18 year, the average was about 85% and the max was 95. You can see that increased in each of the years after 17-18. As we got to 2021, once again, the receipt point utilization was pretty high. It was consistent with the 18-19 and 19-20 years until we had the event in February. The event in February was external to the state and was the definition of an upstream issue that really wouldn't be solved with changing receipt point utilization. And in fact, yeah, there we go. If we go to the next page here, you can see when the event in February happened with the freeze-offs of supplies in the mid-continent area in Texas. What you can see is on the first graph up at the top left, you can see part of the reason that the receipt point utilization was so low in California was that prices were really high. And you can see the price at the city gate here was $140 or more per MMBTU, which is quite a bit higher than the standard, $3 that folks are used to. So for that reason, prices got really high. People declined to purchase gas during those times, which meant the receipt point utilization went down. Then if you go to the chart on the bottom there, it shows the weighted average temperature across the system versus the RPU. Once again, as you see the RPU go down in that February event, the weighted average temperature was mild. It wasn't particularly cold, so it wasn't an event where that gas was particularly needed. So once again, that's why the utilization went down during that event, that I don't think coincides with what we'd be concerned about on a peak type condition. And then finally, the graph on the top right reinforces the same issues. You can see the green line here are the system deliveries on the Socal system. And you can see when that event was going on, the system deliveries were only at about 2.5 BCF. Recognize that the peak day condition on the Socal system is, and we're looking at 4.7 BCF plus. And so you're at 2.5 here, it's much lower. In fact, I can tell you as I look at winter data for the last few years, if you're at a 2.5 BCF system send out day in the winter, that's generally a day when Socalgas would be injecting into storage, not withdrawing. So if that's the case, then effectively this gas that wasn't being bought, either wasn't needed or would have been going for injection. So you just don't inject for a couple of days while this event's going on. So I think because of those reasons, that downward spike is really not related to the availability takeaway capacity on the Socal system. So we kind of ignore that for coming up with the 95% RPU on the peak day. So if we go to the next page, and this just kind of also gives the group a feeling for what did the utilization factor at the receipt points look like over the last 3 years on high demand days. And so what we did is we grabbed the 6 highest demand days over the last 3 years. And you can see all of these are all but one are above 4 BCF. The last one's just about there. And you can see the utilization factor is on average almost 96%. It appears the more recent ones are even higher than the ones that are a little bit more historic. So you can see the utilization factor does seem to be that 95% is pretty representative of what a utilization factor would be on a high demand day in today's environment. Now, two things about this data. First, I will mention that utilization factor is judged against the available receipt capacity. So we will concede that this utilization factor is judged against the capacity today. It's a slight bit lower than it would have been in the past with the outages on the Socal system. But we would also say that this utilization factor includes Aliso Canyon. So as we move forward in time, if you take the receipts away from Aliso Canyon, I think the withdrawals away from Aliso Canyon, in turn, you would end up with folks using their receipt points probably at a higher level than even these. So I think the 95% is representative of a fairly tight system, and folks need to use those receipt points, and in fact they do. So I think from that, we believe that the 95% is pretty representative. So if we go to the next page, and this kind of just sums up our results and our analysis and our recommendations. And that is that for the gas transmission portfolio expansion that we use moving forward, we'd like to recommend the use of a 95% receipt point utilization on our peak day feasibility analyses. So moving forward, and that's consistent with recent high day demand experience. It assumes that the restoration projects are completed on the Socal system, so the system's more robust. As I mentioned before, if you use a lower RPU, you're going to end up with a little bit of a skewed result on gas transmission expansions. It's going to force you to expand the system within the state to offset reductions upstream, which in fact really wouldn't help at all to bring more gas on the system by expanding the in-state system. And then finally, we'll get into another issue on the next page and consider reserve capacity to protect against a facility outage, because we are just suggesting that this 95% is really all about the forecasting error that's embedded in day-to-day operations. And as I said before, for the analysis of all the other portfolios, we're going to recommend retention of the 85% RPU. Once again, that was a result of a collaborative stakeholder process. In those other portfolio assumptions, we're not really changing the Socalgas system, deliverability on the system. So we don't really see a reason to make any changes to the assumption with all the other portfolios. We go to the next slide. And this is just a representative, sort of indicative what this means in the transmission portfolio. And so just to lay these numbers out on the page, if folks that were familiar with the phase 2 reliability assessments that were done, as well as our phase 3 work stream 1 peak day models that we ran for the years 2027 and 2035, we used the capacity that was projected to be in service on the Socal system from the receipt points. And then we used an 85% RPU on the southern and northern zones. And that gave us the numbers in the first column there, which totaled a little bit over 3 BCF in receipts from the 3 zones. The next column is just so you can, as a comparison point as to what's available on the Socal website right now. You can see the numbers slightly smaller than that. The reason it's smaller than that is that there's a lot of work ongoing and evaluations ongoing to restore some of the northern capacity currently. And so the RPU assumption that was used in phase 2 was moving forward for 2025 and 2030. And we've used that in work stream 1 for 2027 and 2035, assuming some restorations were done. Then we jump over to the third column there that says nominal capacity. That was the nominal capacity of the Socalgas system from each zone prior to the large-scale outages that have occurred in the last 5 to 10 years. So what we're proposing is that the first step in our transmission expansion is likely to restore the outages. You know, Socalgas is already doing evaluations with inline inspections, and they're already doing some remediation work on some of those pipes. So our assumption is that with the gas transmission network expansion, the quickest and lowest cost expansion would be to complete all those restoration projects, which would bring us back to the nominal capacity. And you could see, using our proposed RPU of 95%, that would give us a receipt point capacity of 3.4 BCF, just using the 3 zones as they are. And as you can see, that's a pretty big jump versus the assumption in phase 2 of 3.045 BCF that we also used in phase 3 workstream 1. So this would be the first step in our analysis, would be to look at restoring the capacities on the system. And then to the extent additional capacity is needed to meet the demand, we would go back in there and add more capacity and look for other places to expand the system. So I think we can jump to, and I guess the last thing is, as I mentioned before, that winter RPU number today does not include any allowance for an outage. It's really about the forecasting error, the 95%. So if we jump to the next page, this is one other issue that we wanted to bring up. So if we do adjust the RPU to the 95%, and we go with the assumption that that 95% is representative of forecasting errors and inconsistencies between forecast and actual use, then the determination would need to be made is whether we also include any reserve capacity in our proposed gas transmission expansions to offset and or accommodate the potential that there's an outage somewhere on the Socal gas system in the future in the years 2027 or 2035. So what you see here is, in the past or in the current environment, if Aliso Canyon is operating, in the past when Aliso Canyon was operating at full strength, and you had Aliso Canyon coupled with non-Aliso storage and the pipeline receipts, at the historic nominal capacity, then effectively there was more capacity into the system on a peak day than might be needed on a delivery basis, that built in reserve. And so that reserve would accommodate a small outage on the system. If there was a small outage, it was covered because there was a little bit of extra receipt capacity with all of those things working together. As we move forward and we look at 2027 and 2035, the goal of our study is to retire Aliso Canyon. Well, as we retire Aliso Canyon, as Matt said earlier in this process, we end up with unserved load because there's now not enough capacity to serve the existing gas demand in the state. So you're in a tight situation. So if we do a gas transmission analysis and we increase the capacity of the system to ensure that we can serve all of the load, the question is, do we build enough gas transmission capacity to exactly serve that load? Or should we also build some excess reserve portion in case there's an outage somewhere on the system? And so that's, as you can see from the third bullet here, we're looking for input from the stakeholders in this as to what folks think with respect to including a reserve capacity margin to offset an outage on top of a proposed 95% RPU assumption. And then finally, just as examples, on the bottom, I wanted to put some recent examples of Socalgas outages that have occurred. And these are just on the maintenance, have been on the maintenance reports recently on the Socalgas Envoy system. And you can see the impact of different types of outages on the system. You can see the lower operating pressures on line 2000, a couple 100 million a day of capacity reduction. You can see the northern zone outages on line 4000 and 235. That one's significant. On line 3000, another 200 a day. And there's some small pipeline maintenance that can come up over time. Compressor station, you can see the numbers there. So we put these out as examples of the types of outages that could occur over time. And that's, frankly, whether these outages are planned or unplanned, it reduces the system capacity by a certain amount. So the question is, as we expand the system, if we're going to expand the system to meet demand so you have no unserved load, do you expand it just to exactly serve that load? Or do we need to add a reserve to accommodate this type of outage? And you can also see on the footnote at the bottom of the page, for those of you that can read that, it's worth noting that in their 2019 transmission and storage rate case, PG&E is another utility within the state. In addition to their 95% RPU assumption, they included reserve capacity of 250 million a day to support a facility outage on the system. So it would not be a new concept, but it's something that's worth considering, and what kind of cushion folks think is needed to support the demand, and or whether folks are willing to ride with a portfolio where we just build enough transmission to meet demand, and if there's an outage, it's a force majeure. So that's the first part of the presentation. think I might as well go through the second part. That's just an illustration of the nominal capacities on the system. So we can jump past that. If anyone had questions about capacity, we know about, always go back. And now I've got a completely different topic that we'll jump into here, but this is a topic that is very important with respect to the amount of unserved load that's going to exist on the system with retirement of Aliso Canyon. And this was the issue that Matt brought up before that could result in an increase in the unserved load if we change the underlying assumptions with respect to storage on the system. You know, first, just to kind of give everybody background on this, in the peak day analysis that we did in workstream 1, we incorporated a storage assumption that was consistent with the storage assumption that was used within the reliability assessments of phase 2 analysis, which was that the storage inventories were at 90% inventory level on the days that the flow simulation models of peak day needs were run. And as you are aware, as inventories go down at the storage fields, the withdrawal capacity also goes down. So if there's a reason to suspect that you won't have 90% storage inventory when the peak day occurs, then this assumption we may want to adjust. If we adjust the assumption that inventory on the peak day is lower than 90%, then what that does is it in turn lowers the withdrawal capacity. If you lower the withdrawal capacity, you have to get that gas from somewhere else, which means either more unserved load or more offsets. So that's the issue we're dealing with here. And so in order to do this evaluation of the withdrawal capacity, and then the second issue is listed here as the other objective, is we were also looking at the seasonal balancing requirements. You know, there's been a historic injection capacity of 345 million cubic feet a day into storage that has been reserved for the balancing function on the system. And so what we need to be able to do on a seasonal basis is refill the storage in the non-Aliso storage fields after Aliso retirement sufficiently in the summertime that you will have the inventories back up to high levels in the winter to support winter demand, as well as to maintain high inventories as you're seeing for the inventory assumption embedded in here. So the first thing we're doing is we decided to do a seasonal analysis to determine if we can handle seasonal requirements on the system with the storage assets absent Aliso Canyon in 27 or 35. If we can maintain the injection capacity of 345 million cubic feet a day retained for balancing. And finally, if the 90% storage inventory assumption in that is reasonable given the seasonal balancing analysis. The assumptions that we embedded in our analysis, one, Aliso Canyon's retired, so only the non-Aliso storage is in operation. Two, we reserve the injection capacity, as I mentioned before, at 345. So what we've tried to do is handle all injections in the summertime by looking at the total injection capacity and then subtracting from that number 345 million cubic feet a day for balancing and only using the other injection capacity to fill the field. The third is we used 2027 and 2035 gas demand from the California gas report. We did this both on an average temperature year and a cold temperature dry hydro year to evaluate a high demand year and make sure there's enough gas available in storage to handle seasonal demand during that cold year. We made an assumption that the non-Aliso Canyon, and this is consistent with some of the reports that have been done in the past, we made an assumption that the non-Aliso Canyon storage inventory starts with a balance of about 48 BCF. The pipeline capacity that's available in our seasonal analysis is, as you can see, a little over 3 BCF, and I'll jump through that in a second. And finally, that we will include a 90% seasonal utilization of that pipeline capacity that is available. The last bullet here is we've used injection and withdrawal capacity based on some confidential storage withdrawal curves that were provided to the CPUC by Socalgas back in 2019 that we believe represent that are similar to the risk management plan, similar to what would be available per the risk management plan that was filed by Socalgas with CalGEM to operate their storage fields moving forward. So we decided that those curves were relevant for the 2027 and 2035 years. So with that said, we can jump to the next page. This is the, I'll go through this very quickly. This is just the pipeline assumptions that are embedded. You can see the pipeline capacities on the left are largely the same capacities that were included in the analysis in phase 2 for the reliability assessment and in phase 3 for our work stream 1 evaluation. The one thing we took out of that was in those peak day analysis that were done, there was also a volume of gas coming in at Otay Mesa. We made an assumption that due to the fact that Otay Mesa is not always an economic source of gas, we went ahead and excluded receipts from Otay Mesa on a seasonal basis. While some of that may come in on a peak day basis, it's unlikely that it's going to be consistently received during the season for injections or withdrawals. So we zeroed that out, and the rest of them are still there. And then we took that little over 3 BCF of capacity, and as I mentioned before, we applied a 90% load factor to each of those zones. And so that comes up with a pipeline capacity available or utilized of about 2.75 BCF. We jump to the next page. And I think I would keep everybody on the phone for another hour if I went through this in real detail. But what I will say is these spreadsheets are available in here. And what they show are effectively the seasonal balancing results using the 27-28 demand numbers. Everything above the light blue box there is normal weather conditions. Everything below the light blue box there is basically repeated the same analysis, but under cold temperature, dry hydro year conditions. And part of the, and what this is, it's a simple mass balance analysis. So if you go through each of the rows and each of the months, what you'll see is we start with a first of month inventory. As I mentioned before, we try to have about 48 BCF on December 1 each year. And then we withdraw that down to whatever's needed during the winter season by looking at the demand, the seasonal, monthly seasonal demand from the California gas report, subtracting from that the supply that was available each day that we mentioned before. And then if the supply that's available each day that we showed on the previous page is higher than the demand, then we don't have monthly withdrawals. If the supply available monthly is lower than the demand, then you have withdrawals, and that's the balance. And the row there that says excess, what you're seeing there is, for example, if I look at the month of November at the top, you'll see a demand of 71,000 during the month of 71,000 MMCF during the month of November, 82,000 of supply available. So there's 11,000 excess, which in turn tells you that you didn't even need all the supply during that month. And so you could go through this mass balance analysis each month. And you can see on the bottom, quite a bit more storage was used in the seasonal basis under cold weather conditions. As you can see, a lot of big withdrawals. And then on the left side, in the summer months, what we've done is we've injected each month to make sure that we can fill the field back up. And in developing how much injection is used, we have, once again, we reserved that 345 million cubic feet a day of injection for balancing and not used it for system injections. So there's a little bit of cushion there. And you can see, as you would expect, in the summertime, there's quite a bit of excess pipeline capacity available. And this is the 27-28 year. You can see the inventory in the cold weather conditions drops down to about a little bit less than 31 BCF. In the normal weather conditions, it only drops to about 45. So you can see the storage isn't being used as much in the future. And the reason for that is that demand is declining quite a bit in these future years. You know, for example, if you looked at the demand that was in the California gas report, the 2020 demand was about 100, more than 100 BCF higher than the 2027 demand. So that is a significant drop that occurred on an annual basis. And that's why you're seeing a smaller usage of storage on a seasonal basis. And so if we go to the next page, definitely not going to go through the detail on this one. It's the same analysis for 35-36, but you can see very little storage is used in 35-36 on a seasonal basis. Now, I'm not saying it's not required, and I'm not saying it's not required. These non-Aliso fields are not required on a peak day basis, because they definitely are. But on a seasonal basis, the non-Aliso Canyon fields are used less and less. So yeah, we can flip to the next one, that's fine. And this is a summary of the results of those studies. What you see here is we had one case of the 4 cases that you saw on those previous pages. We had one case, which was the April 27-28 gas year, where the storage injection capacity dedicated to balancing, there were a couple of months at the very end of the summer season where the injection capacity was not sufficient to reserve a full 345. Now, I will have to mention, I apologize for this. There's a typo on this page where it says it was reduced to 335. That should say 320. So on this page, in the first bullet there, where we reduced to 335, it should say 320. But it was only for 2 months that there would have been 320 million cubic feet a day available for balancing. The rest of the time, the 345 would have been available for balancing and still covered the required injections. And that was only in that case. In both of the 2035 cases, we were able to reserve the 345 with no problem whatsoever. And in the 27-28 normal weather case, we were able to reserve the 345 without a problem. So our conclusion to all of this in the mass balancing is that we think the storage fields are sufficient to support seasonal demand requirements from storage in 2027, 28 and beyond. And we think that, you know, as we said, they're sufficient to support the requirements, and they're sufficient to reserve this 345 in just about every case. So what we would like to conclude from this is that on a seasonal basis, the non-Aliso fields will be sufficient to meet needs. And we probably won't revisit this issue, you know, unless the group wants us to go back in. But I think from a seasonal perspective, we're covered. And so, you know, feel free to comment on that, but that would be our conclusion from this analysis. Now, if we jump to the next page, Now, here's the other issue that came out of our seasonal analysis, though, and this needs to be brought up. And that is with respect to the 90% storage inventory assumption. What we found in our analysis, if you look at the table in the middle of the page here, what that 90% storage inventory correlated with in phase 2, as well as in phase 3 workstream 1, was a withdrawal capacity available on the peak day of a little bit over 1.3 BCF, see 1329 to be exact, million cubic feet a day. Now we compare that to the withdrawal capacity that was available in each of our seasonal balancing studies. And as I said, each of our seasonal balancing studies, the inventory lowered each month as you use storage. And the worst one, the one where most storage was used was 27-28, cold temp dry hydro year. And you can see as the inventory drops in these non-Aliso fields, the amount of withdrawal capacity also drops each month. So you can see in November or December, we recovered. We were above the 1329. These are represent, by the way, these represent the withdrawal capacity available on the first day of the month. So on the first day of November, we had 1.35. On the first day of December, we had 1.37. But then as you get into January, February, and March, you can see the amount of capacity that would be available from the non-Aliso fields to withdraw is considerably lower than the 1.3 BCF that's embedded in the 90% storage inventory assumption. Now, as you get out to 35, 36, it's not as big an issue. You can see the worst we get in 35, 36 is about 1.26. So to Matt's point, if you reduce the assumption from the 90% inventory and change it to something similar to our seasonal analysis, and we say that on the last day of February, first day of March, there's 1,033 available to be withdrawn from storage. And in the original analysis, we had 1.3. You effectively just cut your supplies by 300 million a day. And that means that's 300 million a day more of unserved load. Now, as I said, this only occurs in the condition of 27-28, cold temp, dry hydro. But this is something that we would like to get some input from the stakeholders on, because that cold temp, dry hydro is also a 1 in 35 type scenario that is embedded within the California gas report, that seasonal demand. So that's definitely a worst case in my opinion, but it does show a critical need for supply and or receipts to offset that withdrawal change. So and obviously that lower inventory would increase the amount of, as I said, unserved load or corresponding facilities that would be needed to replace that unserved load. So we go to the next one. And this is just a summary of the inputs that we're requesting stakeholder input on, and asking if folks would weigh in as we move forward. One, about our question about the 85% RPU assumption. We think it makes sense to retain that assumption for consistency with prior analysis when you're looking at the non-gas transmission expansion alternatives. On the contrary, when we look at the alternative where we're expanding the gas transmission system, we think that assumption ought to be changed, and we think a 95% RPU assumption is appropriate. And if we incorporate that 95% RPU assumption, then depending upon the level of conservatism, we would need to decide whether or not we want to include a reserve for the outages. And finally, at the bottom, with respect to our 90% inventory assumption, the question is, should we stick with the 90% inventory assumption for consistency with prior studies, or shall we look at moving away from that and going to the number, something more similar to what is embedded within the results of the seasonal storage analysis? So we would welcome input on that. on those two issues before we make a final decision on how to move forward. And I think if we go to the next page, we'll get some room for questions. And timing wise, shall we stop and have questions here? Or with the time left, Eileen, or Matt, should we go with Benke, or do you want to stop here for a minute?
I would go on and take questions after the last presentation.
Okay, can everybody hear me? This is Venki.
Yes, Venki, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. So this is the other portfolio that Matt has already described, the electric transmission portfolio. But before I begin, let's get back to one question that was asked before about minimum local generation. And to set the stage again, let me just make sure that that this relates to how we look at all solutions, including the transmission portfolio. So what we did in coming up with the shortfall in the first instance is as follows. What you have is you have a electric system and a gas system, and on the gas system, from the gas system, you're serving the electric system. So the question is that if Aliso Canyon were not there, how much gas could you supply to the Southern California system? And if that shortfall can be expressed in gas terms, which under the assumptions of the study we had was about 434 million cubic feet a day. If you assume that all of that is going to be met by generation, or you're going to try to make up for that by generation, what you'd end up doing is finding the least efficient plants and saying their gas consumption would be lowered by a certain amount. And that's the origin of the 4,800 megawatts that you see there. So I just want to be clear that that's sort of what is going on. The solutions are all about filling that gap. So the transmission portfolio in particular is to close this. Sorry.
Benke, it's Matt. If you could just pause just a quick second there. So, I mean, that was in response to Tyson's question about sort of the modeling. I just wanted to, before we move on, just make sure that resolved it, or if there's any follow-up, we can address it quickly, I think, but we can't address it. All right. Thanks, Benke.
Okay, let me proceed. So with the electric transmission portfolio, we are trying to close the gap by doing the following, by essentially building transmission to bring out-of-state resources into California to an amount that's enough to cover the gap. And that's what we're trying to do here, right? So we're trying to base this based on actual or proposed lines so that it enables us to create realistic cost and other information. The other assumption about the transmission portfolio is that if you assume an online date of 2035 for the new transmission, this means that this will be a solution for 2035. And the basis for that is that we don't think it's realistic to expect that a new transmission line of substantial size to bring in resources, give access to resources outside California can be completed by 2027. So that's the background to the transmission portfolio. So if you go to the next page, here's a map of the Southern California bulk power system. And there are two plausible things we can think of in terms of solutions, and I'll come back to this. One is to think about Southern Nevada and access to Lugo. Lugo is a substation, as you can see from this map on the Southern California bulk power system. The other is to bring in power from Arizona, which would come in near the border, and eventually it would connect to a substation like Devers. In fact, the current Palo Verde line eventually connects to Devers. So the goal of this exercise here would be to solve the problem of bringing in or providing access to about 2,800 megawatts or so in 2035 by increasing the electric transmission capacity into Southern California. As I said before, we'll base the solution on some real world or proposed projects so that we can define them more accurately and also get some cost information and other things that's more grounded in actual projects. So we'd look to specify a line rating around 3,000 megawatts. And then as a result of that, it would do two things. It would make a change to the transmission flow limits between the balancing authorities, which is what we model in Plexos. As I've said before, it's a zonal model, so it would change those transmission flow limits. And in addition, it would modify the maximum import limit, which is from the rest of the WECC into CalISO. So that's a certain number in the modeling right now. That would also change as a result of these. So those would be the parameters we would change in the transmission concept. Next page, please. So there are two project concepts that we're currently looking at. And as I'll point out later, we're open to other suggestions. One is the project concept that would kind of look like what the 10 West line looks like currently. As people on the line may know, 10 West is a 500 kV line from Delaney substation in Arizona to the Colorado River substation in California. It's an actual project that's with an approval date expected in 2021. And it can provide a basis for us to think of a project like that that would bring in more power from Arizona into California. As a matter of information, the CalISO testimony in the 10 West certificate proceeding showed net positive economic benefits for the project. Just keep in mind here that we'll calculate the benefits, but the purpose of the line will basically be to provide access to more resources, not to justify it on a purely economic basis. The 10 West project has a nominal rating of 3,200 megawatts, and it's got a delivery capacity for RA purposes, which we'll come back to, that's much lower. That's the resource adequacy perspective in California. The second project concept, which we're thinking of, is the Silverado Renewables Connection, which would basically bring in renewables from Southern Nevada into California. And basically the current proposal, which is still under development, the Silverado project has a phase one, which would simply upgrade existing transmission in Nevada so that you get more access to more renewables in the renewable zone of of Nevada. In phase two, it would add about 1,250 megawatts of capacity into California by connecting the system to a point called Bishop in California. And Bishop is about 260 miles north of Lugo. And so then you can envision a phase three in which things are built out, more reinforcements are made so that you can essentially bring in power into a substation such as Lugo. Next page, please. Next page. Okay.
Thank you. We have lost your sound.
Okay, am I back? I think I must.
Yes, you're back.
You are.
Sorry.
I
guess
also, if you could accelerate so that we can leave a few
Sure.
minutes for questions, we are over
Okay.
time.
All right. So the transmission portfolio would basically try to increase the capability. And remember that we have a shortfall in the winter. So looking at the two tables here, oftentimes these transmission line impacts focus on the ability to increase the RA capacity. So if you have 1,000 megawatt nominal capacity, sometimes there's an adjustment to account for the fact that because of limiting transmission constraints, only 600 is available for RA purposes. And then there's a further adjustment based on the ELCC, or if it's a solar resource or whatever, right? In our case, we really don't have to worry about the adjustment for the RA, because what we're thinking of is once the line is built, the resources will be dispatched and the line capacity will be available in the winter time where we don't have the same RH. We're not trying to bring in new RA resources. And then the actual amount that the resources get dispatched will, of course, depend on their characteristics. So if it's solar, it'll be based on whatever the solar conditions are. So essentially, once the line is built, the model would dispatch the resources, and if there's enough capacity on generation capacity on the other side, it would essentially fill the gap by using the transmission line. Next page, please. And that simply means we have the following questions for this. I guess one is there if there's any concepts other than the two we've outlined that make sense, we would like to hear them, and also a rationale for why they make sense. We are doing two things here. We're increasing the transmission flow limits between the regional balancing authorities based on which line which transmission portfolio we select. And we also will adjust the maximum import capability to CAL-ISO. And are there other better approaches to developing these portfolios? Those are the questions we have. So with that, let me stop. And as Eileen said, we're already running behind. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So we will take questions and comments on Venky's presentation, but also on everything we have discussed today. I'm going to start by reading some that are in the chat. I know we are past 3:30 when we were scheduled to end, but I hope that we can be available since there are folks waiting to have their comments and questions heard. There are several related chat questions about or comments about this topic of Aliso usage in the past. Marcel Howiger says, regarding the past, SCE estimates that gas prices for SCG Citygate increased electric costs by $800 million in 1 year. Combined impact of AC and pipeline outages. I also believe there were some non-core curtailments, though not 100% positive. Again, can't remember timing. Sorry, I'm trying to keep track of these questions. And Jane Fowler says, yes, we all have that same question. Please add if you were referring to a different one. Susan Gorman Chang says, have you considered there are entire cities in, sorry, I will get to that question. That is a different topic. Marcel Howiger says, and I believe we did not have extreme 1 in 10 winter weather conditions in the past few years. Certainly a very relevant data point. And there are questions about and the polar vortex. Matt Pacuca says that Aliso was available as an asset of last resort, but not used, and it was a cold winter and hot summer. The only time it was used was when Socalgas did not order enough gas that the forecast said they will need from supplies up north. That is documented. And I want to
Actually,
yes, sorry, and some of these relate to analysis that has been done in phase 2 as well. And so I'm going to hand it over to Jean Spencer from the Public Utilities Commission to make some comments, and then I think FTI, if they wish. Jean?
Yes, thank you, Eileen. So first of all, I just want to provide a little timeline of some of the events when Aliso Canyon was at very reduced capacity. So as I'm sure everyone knows, the leak happened in October of 2015. And after the leak, Aliso was actually put on maximum withdrawal because the reason it was put on maximum withdrawal was everyone wanted to reduce the pressure in the field, because the lower the pressure, the less gas would be being pushed out into the atmosphere. So Aliso was on maximum withdrawal from October of 2016 until January 23rd, 2016. So for that winter, 2015-16, for most of the coldest parts of winter, Aliso was on max withdrawal. Once it got down, we had said that Socalgas should maintain 15 BCF in the storage field for emergencies. That was an order from the PUC. So once it got down to 15 BCF, the withdrawals stopped. So there was no prohibition at that point from withdrawing gas from Aliso Canyon, but there was a prohibition on injection. SB 380 required that all the wells at Aliso Canyon be inspected and that they meet CalGEM's inspection requirements. And I believe they also had to be converted to tubing only flow before they could be, before injections could resume. But if so, I have that wrong, please feel to chime in if anyone knows for sure. So while Aliso withdrawals weren't prohibited, because there was so little gas in the field, it was kind of a de facto asset of last resort because no one was sure when injections would resume. So that 15 BCF was all that was going to be available. So interestingly, for ahead of summer 2016, the PUC was actually worried that Socalgas would not withdraw gas to support electric generation and that they would kind of save it for winter. And we actually, the first Aliso Canyon withdrawal protocol directed Socalgas to use Aliso Canyon to support electric generation and avoid curtailments if necessary. As it turned out, it was not necessary in summer 2016. So winter 2016-17 was really the only winter when this condition continued, where there was just 15 BCF in Aliso Canyon. It was a relatively mild winter. The highest send-out days were about 4 BCF. It was 2 days in January. And during those days, Aliso Canyon was used, although not that much. In July of 2017, CalGEM and the PUC jointly, CalGEM verified that all the wells had been inspected to their satisfaction and that injections could resume. And I think the PUC had to also certify that. So at that point, it was possible to re-inject into Aliso Canyon. And so there was more available. And the PUC updated, I believe, the 715 report, which set the maximum, and it kind of changed over the years, but it was higher than 15. I think the lowest it was 24. So just to be clear with what that timeline was and what happened. So there was one winter when Aliso Canyon was not that available, and it was only used a couple of times. So the other thing I think it's important to understand about that is that when we're modeling for a peak day, a 1 in 10 day. So it's the probability of it happening is kind of once every 10 years. So the fact that it didn't happen in 1 year doesn't mean it will never happen. And I think, we haven't had a 1 in 10 peak day since Aliso Canyon, since the incident, which is good. But we could have one. And I think the recent events in Texas demonstrate that, very cold weather can still happen, even in this period of climate change. So I think that's why, as we're looking forward, we still have to plan for these peak events. We still have to make sure that the system can meet this demand. And the other thing, I think someone mentioned that there was this $800 million cost overrun. That is true. So that was in 2018 when Aliso Canyon was still an asset of last resort. So there were definitely in the winters, I don't remember the exact dates, under the Aliso Canyon withdrawal protocol that existed before the current one, Aliso Canyon was an asset of last resort. And so that meant that the electric generators had to voluntarily curtail before Aliso Canyon could be used. So there were various incidents throughout the years when electric generators were asked to voluntarily curtail. And also in February of 2019, they had mandatory curtailments over 5 days. And prices went very high in that winter, as well as in the summer of 2018. So I'm just pointing out these things, that there is this timeline, that there are impacts when Aliso Canyon is used as a last resort, and that I think the most important takeaway is that we're modeling for a 1 in 10 peak event, and you wouldn't expect that to happen every year. So I hope that's helpful to people.
Thank you very much, Jean, for that summary. I also just want to acknowledge and that this in no way means we're not looking for the pathway. This means we want to look for the most accurate pathway. And I think it is very important for myself and for all of you, I'm sure, to appreciate what our starting point is actually. So, and I do recall many of these events, and maybe I can take the point of privilege here and ask some of my questions on these last two presentations. We could. Is that okay, Eileen? Matt?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, thank you very much. I wanted to go back to the transmission presentation first. And I think it was actually mentioned by an earlier commenter that I actually don't remember here, but two questions. Are we incorporating the LADWP transmission projects, and particularly those that may be within the timelines of their recent LA 100 report? And of course, we know many of these are some are more speculative than others, but I just wonder about that. And any other local authority that's not in the ISO. And then the second question is, we recently, someone mentioned some of the IRP decisions that we're currently discussing, but we did recently approve a LTPP decision for the ISO on our end. And it did include, study areas for transmission. And I didn't see at least one, I think maybe a few, mentioned in slide 49, and that maybe this is not the exhaustive list. So that might be why. But just coming, top of mind, I don't have the decision in front of me, but I know that, for example, San Vicente Pumped Hydro Project in San Diego was on that list. I don't think, I mean, it's about 400 megawatts, I believe. So, so those are my two questions.
Okay, let me try to address them. First of all, with regard to what transmission assumptions are embedded in the analysis, let me just take you back to the reference system portfolio, which was developed in the 2019-2020 IR for the 2019-2020 IRP. In fact, did a power flow study and derived from that power flow study a set of transmission flow limits, which was used in all of the modeling for the 2019-2020 IRP, and that was the basis for us to construct the transmission that existed. So that data set does include transmission flow limits into LA and out of LA. So LA is part of the analysis. It's not a Cal ISO analysis in terms of the footprint. Secondly, we are looking at transmission solution to bring in resources or to provide access to California, to resources outside of California to close the gap. So for instance, if there are grid improvements that are made in LA or somewhere else that would close the gap, that would not be in the transmission solution, but what it might do is in the IRP portfolio, there may be more resources built inside California along with accompanying enhancements to the grid. So that's where that would come in. And of course, we'd like to listen to, take into account any such suggestions that come up. And in terms of looking at the possible projects from outside California to provide access to resources outside California, our starting point was really looking at several different Cal ISO transmission plans and seeing what transmission projects they had. And we were looking in particular for large projects that would bring out-of-state, provide access to out-of-state resources. And that's how we came up with two project concepts here, but that's by no means settled yet. We're open to listening to more, but we plan to look at project concepts like that.
Okay, well, thanks for clarifying that distinction. And I guess that's certainly something I will give some thought to, and because there are some in-state transmission related projects, as I just mentioned, and they may in fact be more feasible than some of the out of state. But Thank you for clarifying that. Okay. That's it for me, Eileen.
So I do also want to make call-in users have an opportunity. We have a call-in user, Patty Gluick, who I believe has been waiting for quite some time. Patty, I hope I have correctly found you. I believe you are unmuted.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Okay, yes, many of us have been waiting, and I do want to say that I'm a member of the Aliso Moms Alliance and a member of the Community Advisory Group for the Aliso Health Study that's mandated by the 2018 consent decree. So we're finding out that this has been a terrible situation for the health and safety of this area. There's about 2 million people who live in the valley, and we're being put at risk on a daily basis by Socalgas Aliso facility. So I hope that the people who have been talking about reasons that should be kept open need to be also be considering that the health of the people who live here are very much more important than Socalgas profits. I'm sorry, but that's true, because there's a seismic risk. It's been mentioned before. There's a Santa Susana fault that runs through every single well. Plus, there's also other faults in close proximity. And so if there's a major earthquake fault that has been predicted by many people, including one geologist who made a report with the state about this, it could mean an immediate shutdown of Aliso to inspect all the wells. And there'll be lots of, there'll be much methane gas lost anyway. So where's the problem with reliability? If there's an earthquake, it'll happen then. And there has been many diagnoses of serious medical conditions, including forms of cancer associated with exposure to toxic chemicals. So every day that Aliso remains open, you are increasing the risk to 2 million residents. So again, this is a very serious thing. So why aren't seismic and health risks being part of these proceedings? It's very important. And we also need to look at FTI Consulting, which is a pro-fossil fuels consulting firm. Why are they involved with this particular proceeding when they already represent many fossil fuel companies, and they've even used astroturfing methods to increase their messaging. So again, thank you. But again, there's many people on this phone call, on this meeting, who want to make a comment, and we're suffering immensely in this area. Thank you.
Dorothy, do you want to speak to why consulting was selected? Sorry, I'm picking on you out of the blue.
No, that's fine. I do want to say thank you. I know there's many public commenters waiting to speak. I've been following along in the chat. I should introduce myself, manager of the team that has been responsible for the Aliso Phase 2 advisory work to the judge and the assigned commissioner. And we also ran the the request for proposals that chose the independent consultant FTI for this phase 3 that the governor requested that we engage in, and that, thank you to FTI for all of their slides today. But again, thank you to all our commenters, especially that last comment. I know that you have concerns. We understand the health concerns of the public and all of that. I just want to point out that FTI's role in this matter is to conduct modeling for the commission, which is being done transparently, hence our workshop today, where we are discussing with all stakeholders and the public the assumptions that FTI is using. And we are asking for comment on these when the modeling is done, there is the ability to review in detail all of these outcomes from the modeling. And so we have this open, transparent process to ensure that the results of the modeling are based on facts and vetted through the public process. So that is all. I don't know if FTI wanted to comment as well. I'll turn it back to Matt.
Dorothy, I don't think so. I think you hit the nail on the head. I would add that sort of we think that's a totally fair question, right? Who FTI represents, where they represent them. I think Dorothy really covered sort of the crux of the matter here regarding the transparency that we're bringing to this, and that's all by design and has sort of nothing to do with a response to this particular concern, but just how we conduct these kinds of engagements in the public sphere. I would add, though, that, you know, if there are any concerns that this particular team is bringing any biases to any specific thing that we're doing to this study, we would be very, very eager to discuss them. I frankly don't have too much to add to sort of the broader discussion of what other elements at FTI have done in other segments. But in terms of the work that we're doing here, if there are any concerns or appearances or any worries whatsoever that we're trying to impose our own agenda anywhere in it, please do sort of reach out to the CPUC team, raise the concern during these forums, and that we can certainly take on. And I think we're going to have sort of really good responses to any of those, because as Dorothy says, in a transparent setting like this, I don't know how we would impose our own agenda. So I think that's a discussion we're eager to have.
Turning things back to Eileen, if there's other commenters.
Thank you. Yes, I see a Dave BC. Do you want to state your affiliation and your comment or question?
Yes, sure. Hi, my name is Dave Beasy. I work for Southern California Gas Company. Hi, Matt. I have a question for you and maybe Tim about your mass balances. In the mass balance, you referenced 345 million a day as the injection capacity that's allocated to our balancing service. That's going to be very tough to provide if we don't have the use of Aliso Canyon. But what I'm really thinking is that maybe you've confused it a little bit with your mass balance, because the mass balance was just taking a look at the supply and the forecast demand and putting any excess supply into the storage fields, correct? It never was really looking at whether that excess supply belonged to an imbalance with a non-core account or perhaps a purchase by the core market to fill its storage. Would that be accurate?
I'm going to say hello back to Dave and then kick it to Tim on this one, I think.
Sure. No, I would say, you know, with respect to transactional activity, you're right. This is just an operational analysis. We're looking at the capacity, assuming, as we said before, that the pipeline was used at a 90% level, the capacity that was available to inject and or withdraw. And so, you know, it's basically an operational analysis that comes up with the ability to handle the seasonal needs based on the operational requirements. Now, you know, I understand your question would be transactionally if those volumes were dedicated to go for injections or not. That we didn't look at.
Got it. Thanks for that clarification. The other question I had regarding the mass balance, on slide 43, you mentioned that it included an assumption of the 90% storage inventory and the 1329 million cubic feet per day of withdrawal capacity that was needed at the non-Aliso storage fields, and that your balancing analysis showed that you fell below that level for both the 27-28 balance and the 35-36 balance. So that would seem to say to me that, well, you didn't have the withdrawal you needed because you fell below the 90% level. 90% level, would you say, is maybe too high of an assumption to use for the end of January in this analysis? And if you fell below the withdrawal needed, wouldn't that mean that you have a deeper level of non-core curtailment that would be required? Your send out that your system could support is reduced, and so that megawatt gap would increase based on the base condition that fell out of the phase 2 analysis. Would that be?
I think you understand the math exactly right. That's exactly what we're saying, is that when we looked at our seasonal analysis and we compared the withdrawal capacity that was available in the later months of the winter in that cold temperature 27, 28 condition, what we found was that the withdrawal capacity that was available was below the 1329 that was embedded within the assumptions for phase 2 studies and for the phase 3 workstream 1 studies. So that's what we're kind of teeing up here, is our seasonal analysis shows a lower number available, not the 1329, and we're kind of opening that up for comments as people weigh in with their written comments over the next week or so, or as to what they think of that assumption moving forward.
Got it. Thank you very much, Tim, for the clarification.
Thank you. And next with their hand raised, I have a Christian Lambert.
Hi, this is Christian Lambert with Cal Advocates, Public Advocates Office. It would help us to construct our comments if FTI could explain how the two electric side scenarios, the IRP-driven scenario and the transmission for delivery at Lugo or Devers, will enable the backfilling of any local resource adequacy shortfall. I think it's clear to us from the materials how we get at the system RA backfilling, but unclear how any local resource adequacy shortfalls would be addressed.
Venki, you want to take a stab at that one?
Can I make one comment on that to start with? You mentioned resource adequacy, which is largely a summer-driven concept. I don't think that when we talk about a gap of whatever the gas million cubic feet per day is translated into megawatts, that means that you have to procure that much more RA capacity anywhere on the system, right? All it means is that in winter, if you can on that critical peak hour in the winter, if you can deliver 4,800 megawatts or whatever the number might be for the scenario we're looking at of electric generation, then you've covered the gap. So we're not trying to fill RA capacity per se. With regard to the second part about what you said, the local RA requirements, again, it's a RA requirement, but in any event, we're trying to look at this at a system level. So we're not really looking at local RA, or for that matter, we're not even looking at system RA, except for the fact that in the base case, since we went for the reference system portfolio, we know that the RAs, that the reliability standards have been met for the portfolio that we have.
I appreciate it. I'll leave it for more questioners. Thank you.
I'm muted, but thank you. We have a few call-in users. There's not a straightforward way to identify if they have questions except to unmute them. I'm going to unmute all of you, and please say something if you have a question. This will be your opportunity. And if not, then we will move on. I think one of you had spoken, so so we will move on. I have a Helen with hand raised. Please go ahead.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. My name is Helen Atai. I live in Granada Hills. I'm a co-founder and a member of Aliso Moms Alliance, who's lived in Granada Hills for the last 30 years. I have been taking my family members to ER numerous times last 5 years. I have been watching my neighbors, my friends, teachers in the community, all diagnosed with cancer. 5 teachers from one school within 1 mile of the facility have already died. 7 have been diagnosed. So many parents, employees, little kids have been diagnosed with cancer and other environmental health issues in our area. I do not understand. I've been listening here for the last 3 hours about reliability, numbers, bunch of big words, and everything that I've been hearing for the last 5 and some years. But where is our health in this all this? Where is the health department advocating for our health? I mean, if we have a lot of documentation and witnesses and people who have been diagnosed with cancer, people who have lost family members, we can bring all of them to you if Department of Health is not stepping up, speaking on our behalf. We have a lot of documents here, test results. You just need to look at that, please. I'm begging you, and that's not in my nature to beg anybody. I'm begging you to take that as a factor in your decision making. We are people here. We are dying. We are sick. My kids are suffering. I'm suffering. My husband has been going to ER. I mean, this is no joke. We're just talking about dollars and money. I mean, what is that if I'm dead? I mean, the money doesn't have any value in this. I mean, it does as a business, but please keep this in mind that we are people who are living here. We are suffering, and we have had enough. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if someone from FTI or CPUC would like to respond, or shall we take additional comments?
Speaking for FTI, I mean, we're nothing but sympathetic to this issue, and it's one of the reasons why we're happy to be here to maybe help. But I'll leave it to CPUC to comment on sort of events to date.
Also, Governor Newsom has promised us he's going to shut this place down as soon as in office. I don't know why he's not, stepping up and he looked into my eyes and he told me he will shut this place down because he knows we're suffering. Where are these people? Where is Governor Newsom? Where is Supervisor Barger? Where is Department of Health? Where is everybody? I mean, do you guys have hearts? Please, I'm just desperate.
Thank you, Helen. I really appreciate your urge to action here, and I want to recognize that it's taken us way too long to get to this phase, but I am also very excited that we're finally at this stage. And sorry, my kid is yelling in the background. If you're hearing that, I apologize. All I can say now is that I'm certainly dedicated to working on this in earnest, and our timeline is pretty quick to get to this pathway and to actually get to a place where we have a portfolio that we're going to invest in to be able to do this. So I think I'm here and I'm listening to your urgency, and I thank you for your continued involvement. Thank you.
And I want to echo what Commissioner Guzman-Aceves just said. You know, my staff are the advisory team helping the commissioner and the judge. You know, we're managing this contract with FTI to do this analysis so that we can help the decision makers make their policy choices. So, you know, we thank you for coming and giving us your comments. We are listening to you, and we definitely, you know, the community surrounding the field is an important constituent that we are listening to. So thank you for coming today to listen to all of this. very detailed and technical analysis about the statewide reliability impacts of the field. And I know it's very technical, but thank you for bringing the human side today as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And next in the queue, we have Janice Nardella.
Hi, I'm also a longtime resident of Porter Ranch. We live right across from the facility, and our house was actually here before the gas facility put gas in there. So I think we have a right to be here, and they don't. As it was mentioned, Governor Newsom was supposed to shut this facility down. He promised before 10 years, and now you're discussing 2027 or 2035, which is absolutely ridiculous. My family is basically stuck in their house. We can't go outside because of the gas smells every time they do injections or withdrawals. It affects our family. And we know many people that have gotten cancer in this area. And the facility needs to be shut down before 2027, definitely before 2035. I can't even believe they're discussing 2035.
Sorry, are you complete, or would you like to continue?
I'm just really disgusted. I'd like to be able to open my windows and doors like everybody else in the world, and I can't. We have to have air cleaners running constantly, and you know, people are complaining about smells and, I mean, poisons in the air, and you know, it's not fair that we have to live like this because the facility can't be shut down sooner. So I'm hoping that it will happen before 2027, and I don't even know why is 2035 even an option? Thank you.
Alexandra Nagy, you are unmuted.
Hi, yes, Alex Nagy here with Food and Water Watch. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Yeah, just to echo Janice's comment right before me, you know, this question of why 2035 and why 2027 is a very good one, because this community was promised 2027 by Governor Brown. But Governor Newsom very quickly said, you know what, that's not fast enough. I understand this is a health crisis issue, and we're going to do it faster. We're going to fast track that. But that's not happening. It's just more pleasantries, nice words, lofty promises, and empty actions. And I appreciate the governor's directive to at least get us this far. We're finally studying how we're going to shut this down. But really, 5 years later, we're finally asking the right questions. We don't have the right conclusions yet, and I urge you all to really consider a faster shutdown timeline. Go to the governor, ask for his leadership to move this forward. We can do this, and that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would ask, if you have commented, could you put your hand down because it makes it easier to see who is still waiting their turn. Next, we have Jane Fowler.
Hi, can you hear me? Hello? You can. Oh, okay. My name is Jane Fowler. I live in Granada Hills. I'm co-founder and member of Aliso Moms Alliance. And, you know, I'm a resident, so I'm bringing the human side. I just want to point out that during the meeting, I had the smell of gas, so I had to close my window. which sucks. But anyway, my family, we're still having ongoing health issues. During the blowout, my beloved dog, Missy, she died. And I just want to also share that when leaving this area, my health improves. For example, I was gone for 4 months last year, and upon returning, some of my symptoms return immediately. And as time goes on, I begin to feel like I never left. And one example is that my hands had stopped trembling while I was away. And now they're shaking again, so much so that some days I have to eat with a large spoon, not a fork. So this affects, my mental and emotional health as well. And I just want to point out that the South Coast Air Quality Management District reports that Aliso Canyon routinely emits carcinogens and chemicals like formaldehyde, benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, xylene, acetaldehyde, uranium, acrolein, ammonia, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen oxides. And Dr. Jeffrey Nordella found uranium, ethylbenzene, acrolein, styrene, and heavy metals in our hair, urine, and blood in significant concentrations. And, I believe that one or probably more of these are contributing to my, shaking hands, my hair falling out. Actually, my teeth are falling out along with my cats, and other health conditions. And I just want to remind you that this is a health crisis for us. And Governor Newsom, he did promise me personally to shut it down, and just to the world in general, quote, immediately engage an independent third-party expert to identify viable alternatives to the facility and scenarios that can inform a shorter path to closure. He said expedite the closure. And also the county supervisor, Catherine Barger, and her whole board of supervisors unanimously voted for the expedited closure. And the CEC, California Energy Commissioner Robert Weissmuller, also requested for expedited closure. And requesting the closure of Aliso storage goes back to Governor Jerry Brown. So I urge Governor Newsom and please you, the CPUC, to shut down Aliso. I think that when you all use the 31 mitigation measures to readjust the gas system and the electric grid to operate smoothly, that it did. And this is why Aliso was not necessary for 2 years. In 2017, the EES consulting report showed that using these 31 mitigation measures, if they were maintained, Aliso wouldn't be needed for energy reliability in the summer or the winter. And now that we're at this increased usage of 3,000%, which is what the gas company wants. But again, I want to say, what about our health? And I'm sorry, but y'all kind of weakened the withdrawal regulation so that this allowed Socalgas to use Aliso as the gas company, wanted to. And at a minimum, I would please ask to go back to the original protocol and use Aliso Canyon as a last resort. These aren't numbers or graphs for us who live here. It is our lives. So please use the 31 mitigation measures and use Aliso as a last resort. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have Deirdre Bologna is up next.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, yes, hi. My name is Deirdre Bologna. I'm a 20-year resident of Porter Ranch, which backs up to the Aliso Canyon gas storage facility. I was very happy to hear Matthew with FTI in the very beginning, almost his first lines, bringing up that we can shut Aliso down as long as we generate more power elsewhere. Very nice words to hear, but my concerns are that FTI has been called out in published articles as a gas and oil front group. And just like Socalgas has many times manipulated the numbers and the gas supply, I don't really have hope that FTI will come out with their final reports in favor of the people, the community that's sick, and not just the interests of Socalgas. Anyways, we have any of you put in place or stop to think about the cancer and the disease and the people who are living on the front line of this toxic facility that has gas escaping at every coupling, at every dehydrator, at every compressor? It's coming into our windows at night as we're sleeping. Just last night at 3 a.m, we had another stench coming. But guess what? We don't know. We don't know what the numbers are because Socalgas turned off their monitors again. This happens all the time, and you can tell by the stress in my voice that I am sick and tired of it. I lost my father to this facility. As many friends. My friend had brain cancer that used to hike in the creek every single day. Well, she paid the price. Like, we're all paying the price. We need help. No one is doing anything except crunching numbers in favor of Socalgas and how they can stay in business. Meanwhile, there's another generation being raised in the cloud of polytoxins. All right. And no one is doing anything. Every time I come to one of these modeling meetings, I just hear how reliability and keeping the prices down is good. Well, Socalgas just asked for a new price increase. So I don't think they're interested in keeping the price down unless we're asking for it to be shut down. Then, oh, it's not feasible because of the money. Well, they're asking for money to pay for storage. And they're allowed 35%. They're asking for more. Is CPUC are you guys going to grant that? I mean, they seem to get everything they want, and we don't get anything that we want. Please, I heard your words that you are taking this into consideration. Please take the people that are sick, that are living under this cloud. Please take them into consideration, and the next generation of children that play on that playground, or did play, and they will play again when they open the schools, and breathe that toxic, carcinogenic bile every day. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have Kyoko Hibino. Kyoko, you are
Yeah.
unmuted.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Hi, my name is Kyoko Hibino. I live in Porter Ranch for 13 years, and I am co-founder of Porter Ranch. Aliso Canyon needs to be shut down right now, not in 2027, because it's really because of the public health crisis and continuous threat to the communities by sitting on the ticking bomb of gas, from nosebleed to cancer and many evacuations. I have it at all. I have it. And this has to stop. And communities still now suffer ongoing emissions from the facility. And CPUC is continuously ignoring the assessment of public health and managing and regulating safety and emergency response. Besides fundamental issues, we have the gas is phasing out, electrification needs to be factored in. The city of LA just released a study on the capable to achieving 100% renewable, 90% in 10 years without any blackout. And LAPD will shut down all local gas generation power plant. 42 cities and counting in California already adopted to limit or ban gas hookup in new constructions. We all also don't want renewable gas stored in Aliso Canyon, which requires tremendous infrastructure upgrade cost So instead of upgrading, we need you to step up from business as usual, as Governor Newsom's, and shut down Aliso Canyon for safety by starting to limit to minimum capacity for last resort right now. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have Lori Evazian.
Hi, thank you for listening to our comments here. I'm also a resident of Porter Ranch for almost 21 years. I live a little less than 2 miles from the facility. Like others, we can't open our windows, can't enjoy a pool, can't enjoy our yards. My daughter's kindergarten teacher is dead from cancer at Castle Bay Elementary. Her third grade teacher is dead from multiple myeloma. Many other teachers that she knew of in the school when she was there have also died. The neighbor across the street from me is on his second reoccurrence of leukemia. A neighbor 2 doors up from me when we first moved in died of leukemia. Neighbors in our cul-de-sac as well lost their son to a cancer, and the mother is currently dying of cancer. This is all anecdotal for you, but we're living it. You have to somehow take into account the health effects of this facility on the almost 2 million people that live near the facility. All I hear is Socalgas excuses for not being able to close the place. And I know that you're looking into closure of it, but as others said, Governor Newsom promised us it would be closed. So that is the goal here. But I don't hear this being the goal, and would appreciate very much if you would listen to those who are being affected by this facility. I know reliability is very important, but it's not more important than people's health. Thank you.
Thank you. And I believe those are the raised hands for folks who had not yet commented. I still have a couple raised hands, people who I believe may have wanted to say more. I am mindful that it is 4:30. I don't have a formal way of setting how long to go. I believe that we could go till 5 if people are interested. So I am going to unmute a few more who still have raised hands, starting with Isim Najim.
Hi, thank you. I do have some technical questions, if you don't mind. And you know, you've eliminated some of the breaks in the middle, so I have to go back to some of the earlier ones. There was a comment made on building electrification that you said, you know, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, and that they would require additional generation facilities. But maybe I misunderstood that. But we're trying to shave the peak here. So if the outcome of building electrification is that you cut on the gas use, you increase the electric production, the capacity for electric production during the winter is there. There's a lot of idle capacity. So it would not need any additional generation. The only question is it a more efficient system or is it a less efficient system? And I don't know the answer to that, but you can only really eliminate building electrification if it is not a more efficient system to take you in that direction. Is that not correct?
That is absolutely correct. And we don't have quite all the answers to it yet. Mechanically, the way it works, it's a great question and it's sort of a nuanced topic. mechanically, the way it works is if we do nothing and we just retire Aliso, then we have what we're calling a capacity shortfall, but it's a generation shortfall during the peak hour, right? Or the critical hour. And so what that means is we need to replace that lost gen with more generation that doesn't rely on natural gas, or at least natural gas from Aliso Canyon. So what happens is if we choose to reduce our gas consumption by electrifying, then we have to have even more electric gen that's not reliant on gas or not reliant on Aliso Canyon to sort of displace that. That is the challenge that we have with it. And we have some data that suggests that maybe the ratios there aren't super favorable. Now, the commissioner makes an excellent point, and we're not dismissing this idea out of hand. That's not to say that this cannot be done. You could, if you have the right sort of efficiency balance, which you hit the nail on the head with that, actually do it off, right? Pull it off, right? If you effectively reduce gas consumption more quickly than you reduce the need for new non-gas generation, then this would work directionally. And we would then just have to figure out whether it makes sense economically and operationally and all that stuff. So that you understand fully the problem, and then the solution is we don't know yet. And our ask to the group is, how should we think about this, and whether there's any data or any insights out there sort of among the stakeholders or reports and information that they're aware of in the public domain that we could use to sort of better understand that.
Okay, maybe I'll mention something in the comments later, because I didn't make my comments straight. But let me move on to another point. I'm a little confused in slide 39 when you talked about the 3055 BCF. Can you go back to slide 39, I believe? Right. So you mentioned earlier that in your analysis on the pipeline usage capacity, you ended up with the change to the nominal times the 95% utilization rate. You ended up with a 3425. But yet in the analysis of the balancing, you are using 3055 as the transmission capacity. So I'm confused with the mixing of these things. Why are you not, since these are simulations, why isn't that number carried through on the transmission to the balancing analysis?
Yeah, let me explain that. The purpose of the balancing analysis was to see if we thought we had enough storage on the seasonal basis, and that needs to go to every one of our portfolios. So we look at not just the expanding the transmission system portfolio, but we look at the other portfolios which use the existing gas system. And as I mentioned before, we're only increasing the capacity of the pipeline system in that one case. The other three feasibility analysis, the pipeline capacity stays the same. So this is effectively a conservative worst case analysis, in my opinion. And so we're using the lower pipeline capacity that would exist after the other three cases.
So then when is it that you're using the 95%? I mean, I'm confused.
Okay.
We talk about that as the basis for modeling, but then we use something else in the balancing.
I understand the question now. So there's really two different models. The first is the peak day model that Matt keeps referring to, the peak hour and or the peak need or the peak day that we're trying to serve. And so what we do is we run an evaluation of the system to see how much gas can be delivered on a peak day. And that's what we were talking about when we were increasing the capacity of the gas system to move gas to serve the unserved load. And that was the case where we increased the capacity of the system. The other three cases, we did not increase the capacity of the system. We did other things. Now, that was the peak day analysis. This is a different analysis. This is a seasonal balancing analysis where we look at how much gas is used each month during the year and how much gas needs to be injected and withdrawn from storage. And so how much pipeline capacity is there to come into the state to meet that seasonal annual need and or meet injection and withdrawal requirements across the year, which is a very different thing than a peak day.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. And I believe we have more questions or comments from Tyson Siegel.
Hi, yes, this is Tyson Siegel with Protect Our Communities Foundation. I wanted to go back to the early slide there where it's talking about the peak hour and then what the generation shortfalls are. I think I understand a little bit better what you're getting at there, but I wanted to sort of do a compare and contrast between this and the recent report that the Energy Division put out in January on Aliso Canyon. And the Energy Division's report really indicated just a very small number of days during the decade. 34 is what we came up with when we were counting. During the decade that you would end up with shortfalls and you'd have to put mitigation measures in place. When you are taking a look at these shortfall occurrences, are you seeing something that is similar to that? Are you seeing a very small number of days, very small number of hours as well?
We're not looking at it this way. What we're relying on is the California gas report forecast of demand, from which we take the 1 in 10 demand case. So by definition, the day that we're modeling is supposed to happen 1 day out of every 10 years, and that's the planning standard. And we're just aligning around that. We do not have any analyses of sort of how frequently. We don't validate the forecast in the sense of sort of understanding how frequently some level of consumption is going to emerge, nor do we try to sort of back solve for the second lowest constraint day, the third lowest constraint day, and so on and so forth. So they really are kind of apples and orangey a little bit in ways that are hard to kind of reconcile, and certainly on. It's not a very sort of direct answer, but that's I think where we're at.
I see. Okay, and then the next question I had is on the and maybe when the previous response talked a little bit about this, which was the seasonal balancing, and it may just be due to seasonal balancing, you just didn't need it. But on slide 39, there is a reference to OTI Mesa and a 400 MMCFD capacity, and then an assumption of 0. And is that because the seasonal balancing was able to be sufficient? Seasonal balancing didn't have any issues, and so that 400 MMCFD wasn't needed? Or is it assumed that that 400 MMCFD would just really not be used at any time?
Yeah, frankly, it's the way to answer that would be if a peak day type condition came up, then the assumption is that yes, there probably would be some receipts at OTI Mesa. With that said, when you do, as you just mentioned, when you do a seasonal analysis, OTI Mesa is likely the last point to be used, and it generally does not have as economic a supply source, so it generally isn't used on a day-to-day basis. So we just assume it's not used, and that makes the study a little bit more conservative because there's less supply available, and yet we still effectively came up with a solution that works on a seasonal basis.
Got it. And then the last thing that I wanted to ask about here is when mitigation measures are put in place. And it seemed like so I guess we're going back to slide 6. When mitigation measures are put in place, is that what we're looking at right here? There's still a shortfall according to your calculations, and this is just a 1 in 10, not considering mitigation measures for 1 in 35.
So it's important to so basically the answer is yes, mostly, but perhaps not quite through the same mechanics that you have in mind here. The concept behind this modeling is that we're trying to identify, again, the amount of generation that wouldn't be servable hypothetically in a world without Aliso Canyon. That is different in sort of some meaningful ways than saying we're modeling what happens if we retire Aliso Canyon, don't do anything else, and then just let the world fall apart in 2021. That's not actually what we're sort of trying to do. We're solving the problem kind of economically and efficiently in the economic sense, which is to say that, we calculate how much generation the system needs that day. And then we figure out how much gas that would require. And then we figure out how much gas we have without Aliso Canyon. And the difference is the gas shortfall. And then we say to ourselves, well, if we had this gas shortfall, how much generation would we lose? And we have made, I think, the very reasonable assumption that we would sort of choose to replace the least efficient generation in the stack, which is different than saying that if these specific circumstances actually emerged, this is what Socalgas would actually choose to curtail in some way, shape, or form. Probably the answer is very close, but it is like a different kind of concept. So I think probably the answer to your question is, yeah, this reflects sort of how the market would be managed and curtailed, and certainly directionally, this is probably about right. But if you tell me that like Socalgas would have certain rank orderings of individual specific facilities that might differ somewhere on the edges from the selections that we made, I would believe you, but I don't think it's sort of meaningful for purposes of the discussion that we're having here. Does that make sense?
Sure. I guess my concern is that any analyses that are completed would be taking a look at how to shut down Aliso Canyon, which clearly that's what you're taking a look at, and how to do that as quickly as possible. And what happens if Aliso Canyon is shut down immediately, and what the ramifications of that are. And when I'm comparing this to the Energy Division's report, it really looks like you're right there. I mean, they're two different things. Yeah. There's a lot of really interesting information in the Energy Division report in terms of just how frequently these events occur. And if we're talking about curtailing gas or gas-to-gas customers on just a handful of days every year, 2, 3, 4 every year on average, then that seems worthwhile, regardless of the fact that it's going to cause a little bit of inconvenience. We're not talking about a situation like we saw in Texas where people were freezing to death. We're talking about a completely different scenario here, and so I was just trying to understand a little bit better the direction that FTI is taking in the analysis. So I appreciate the responses.
And I can't say the way we did it necessarily comes up with the minimum shortfall. So in terms of directionally, if we took some other approach to identifying the resources that wouldn't be able to be served given the gas shortfall, the only thing we could do other than select the least efficient ones, the only other outcome we could if we did anything else would be to increase this megawatt shortfall. So our approach, which we think is reasonable, minimizes kind of the lift or the gap here. As for your other observation, would some amount of sort of would some lower level of reliability be permissible? It's totally fair to say we have taken it as a given that we are going to maintain reliability. We understand that to be our mandate. We understand that to be the planning criteria. To the extent that others feel differently about that, I think sort of the written comments are a good place to weigh in there, and we can appreciate that perspective. We're gonna leave that decision, I think, to others. I get the impression that would be a lift to get over, but certainly, you know, it's a fair perspective to have, I think.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. I think we have a few more questions that we can get to from the chat. There's one from earlier from Susan Gorman Chang. Have you considered there are entire cities in California that have outlawed gas in any new buildings? Has this been included in the demand analysis?
I don't think so. I will say this, we most certainly have not made any explicit adjustments in the demand outlook, which I think is the question. We're relying on the California Gas Report demand outlook. I could not honestly say, without going and digging into that document, whether the developers of that forecast themselves considered this question. So I don't know. But I can say we haven't made any adjustment to reflect it, and all the inputs and sort of rationales underlying that outlook should be available in the public domain. I think probably not in the sense that the questioner is asking, but I couldn't say for certain.
Thank you. And there's a question from Anthony Aquila from, sorry, it did say, I believe he said he was from a city. He says, Matthew, how does the peak gas consumption in your model compare to the situation that took place with the polar vortex that we experienced in February 2021, where Aliso Canyon made up for a gap in gas supplies to meet the demand?
I don't know how those numbers match up. I think, and Tim might be able to help me out on this, but I think it's important that we parse out what happened in February 21 regarding the participation of Aliso Canyon in terms of reliability versus economics. And so far, most of what we've talked about today has been centered on reliability. How much gas do I need from Aliso Canyon to keep the heat on, to keep the lights on? I think what we observed in February 2021 was economics, where the events in Texas made gas very expensive. And when it did, local consumers who had the option to withdraw gas from Aliso did that instead of buying the very expensive market gas, which is an important dynamic here, but also is kind of a separate thing. Tim, correct me where I'm wrong on any of the above, and please do jump in on that.
No, I think you're right. And that, if you recall, that was one of the charts we showed, was what was going on in February 2021. Probably high 20s, low 30s, somewhere in those numbers. But we showed the charts and walked through that when that was happening, the send out on the system was only about 2.5 BCF. Whereas, so in California, send out was about 2.5 BCF on the Socal system, whereas the peak day that we're designing around now is 4.7 for the year of 2027. Well, this is a good chart to look at too, and you can see, you know, send out peak days over the last 6 years, we've got to maybe 4.1 BCF, and the 1 in 10 scenario that we're evaluating now is the 4.7. If you go back a few pages, you can see 2021. Go back 1 or 2 more. I don't know. I guess it was in front of us. Sorry. There you go. That was
31 and 32.
Go to 30. There you go. That's the actual day. And so the chart at the top on the right shows deliveries, the system deliveries on the Socal system as reported on their Envoy system. And you can see you're right around 2.5 BCF when that red line drops. And when that red line drops, that happened during the February event. So effectively what that means is the receipts into the Socal system dropped significantly because gas prices went way up. Supply was a little bit down because of what was going on in Texas, but effectively the demand in California wasn't that high at that time.
I have I have my own follow-up question, actually, Tim. I think we've heard a few variants. We've heard a few questions that sort of all touch on similar issues of why is the demand you folks are modeling so very high compared to some other observations that have been made? Could you just take 30 seconds and talk about how it is, you know, we're modeling the 1 in 10 and sort of how that conforms to best practices and what that means and doesn't mean?
Yeah, we can. The 1 in 10, as you've mentioned a few times, is the demand number that comes out of the California gas report, and it's the projected peak day demand number to meet the needs of the customers in the state of California. And the 1 in 10 is effectively all the customers, the core and the non-core. And what we see is that in the year 2027, that 1 in 10 forecast is about a little bit over 4.7 billion cubic feet a day. When we go out to 2035, that number declines. It's about 4.6 BCF a day. So that's part of the reason that when we did our seasonal analysis, you know, that was peak day, but monthly demand does the same thing. But that was part of the reason that we need less storage on a seasonal basis as we move forward. But that 1 in 10 and meeting the peak day demand, that is industry standard to meet that peak day demand, no matter where you are, because on that peak day, that's in a winter especially, that's a condition when it's as cold as it's going to get. And, you know, generally you don't want to be shutting off gas to people and power to people when it's the coldest weather you have. And so we try to make that reliability standard, and that's pretty consistent with around the country that, you know, people strive to meet that peak day demand, however you do it. And you know, as this 1 in 10 event, you've mentioned the Texas event a few times, and I would just say that, you know, that's an event that was very destructive, but it's something that happens 1 in, you know, 30 years. Probably hasn't gotten that cold in Texas in the last 30 years. So, you know, does that mean you don't protect against that event because it doesn't happen but once every 30 years? Well, I think after what happened a month ago, people would argue, you know, you do protect against that event. You want to be ready for it. So, you know, that's why that's generally best practice.
Thank you for taking my question.
Sure.
Thank you. I think there were a couple more questions in the chat from folks who have since logged off. And since we are nearing the close, I think we may just have to leave those. I do see a couple other hands from folks who I am guessing have not meant to leave them up because they look like they're away. And there's a hand from Norman Peterson. Norm, do you, sorry, I'm confusing people.
I just lowered my hand.
Oh, okay, thank you. So I think that sorry, I'm reading the chat while trying to talk. Janice Nardella asks, is there a reason we can't have Aliso just used for emergency use? And that is our last chatted comment or question. Actually, perhaps that segues to, I think, also looking at the time, it's time to wrap up. I'm going to hand it over to ALJ Zhang to close us out. Thank you all.
Hi, I will be very short and then give Commissioner Guzman-Aceves a few minutes to make closing comments. Thank you for all of your very thoughtful questions and your participation. This proceeding is a priority for the Commission. We appreciate your analysis and your involvement. Parties may comment on the workshop and the materials by filing opening comments on April 13th and then reply comments on April 27th. If you are not a party, you may submit comments through the Aliso Canyon email, and that is Aliso Canyon OII at cpuc.ca.gov. There is also more information on the Aliso website, which is www.cpuc.ca.gov /Aliso OII. Commissioner Guzman-Aceves?
Thank you very much, Judge Zhang, and thank you so much to everybody in the public for taking so much time again and just recognition of your longstanding dedication to this issue. I'm actually, again, very excited for this phase to really develop a pathway with concrete actions to attain the closure and to really get to a common understanding of what it's going to take. So it's so important to hear all of the input today, but of course, everything that will be followed up from all of you on how we can best develop that pathway. And anyway, I mostly just want to share that appreciation and our eagerness to really get to work here and set some concrete and ambitious goals for this closure. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. We will recording and see you again next time.